Where are you watching from? Midnight? 2 in the morning? That liminal space between today and tomorrow, where the modern world softens at its edges. You're in the right place. Go ahead. Dim the lights. Turn your screen brightness down until it's just a whisper of illumination. Let the sharp angles of the present dissolve, because tonight we're going somewhere older than time zones, older than temples, older than the word history itself. This is your quiet corner of the internet, where we tell stories the way your ancestors would have wanted them, slowly, symbolically, and surrounded by imaginary firelight. If you like long, poetic storytelling about forgotten humans, buried gods, and prehistoric rhythms, this might just be your new nighttime ritual. So settle in. This is not just a documentary, it's a sleepcore history of what life really felt like before the first cities were even a dream in the dust. And if you'd like to support more slow, mythic storytelling for tired sapiens, a like and subscribe is always appreciated. No pressure, no algorithm panic, just quietly helpful. Now, let's begin. You wake before the sun does. Not because you're anxious about a deadline, not because there's a meeting circled in red on your calendar, not because of some glowing rectangle screaming notifications in your pocket. You wake because the fire beside you has shrunk to embers, and the cold is beginning to seep through the gaps in your shelter like water through cupped hands. Someone needs to feed it before the warmth dies completely. The sky above is still a deep, bruised blue, that particular shade that exists only in the hour before dawn. Not quite night, not yet morning. The air carries layers of scent. Wood ash from last night's fire, the musky leather of the hide you're wrapped in, dried sweat, smoke, and something else. The green smell of dew forming on grass just beyond the shelter's edge. You stretch inside a dwelling made of bent willow branches and stretched animal skin, its walls breathing faintly with the pre-dawn wind. The structure moves like a living thing, responding to every shift in the air. There are no clocks here, no alarms shrieking you into consciousness. But the rhythm of night fading into morning is so deeply embedded in your body that it might as well be carved into your bones. Your circadian rhythm isn't fighting against blue light or struggling with jet lag. It's perfectly synchronized with the planet's rotation. This is not a rare camping trip, a weekend escape from your real life. This is your life, and has been the life of your ancestors for tens of thousands of years, stretching back into a past so deep it has no bottom. It is around 10,000 years before the Common Era. There are no cities anywhere on Earth. The very concept hasn't been invented yet. No empires drawing lines on maps that don't exist. No governments collecting taxes that haven't been imagined. No temples reaching toward gods that haven't been named. No roads cutting scars across the landscape. The wheel hasn't been invented, won't be for another 5,000 years. The only architecture is firelight and memory. The only permanent structures are the stories passed from mouth to ear to mouth again. And yet, across what we now call the Levant, Eastern Africa, Europe, and Asia, small groups of Homo sapiens stir beside flickering hearths, speaking in languages that left no written trace, only the ghost of their grammar in our modern tongues. They speak in whispers and gestures, in tone and touch, a communication rich with meaning we can barely imagine. These are not the cavemen of Saturday morning cartoons, all clubs and grunts and dragging knuckles. Despite what those simplistic stories told you, caves are rare refuges, not permanent homes. Most humans at this time live in open-air camps, in mobile bands of 20 to 30 people, extended families bound by blood, marriage, and mutual survival. They migrate with the seasons like the animals they follow, reading the landscape like a beloved book whose pages change with weather and time. They follow the thundering herds of reindeer in the north, the graceful gazelles in the grasslands, the spawning salmon in the rivers. They know where the berries ripen first after the spring thaw, where the nut trees cluster in hidden valleys, where the bees make their homes in hollow logs. They carry everything they need, Stone tools worn smooth with use, gut-stitched baskets waterproofed with pine resin, sinew-bound spears with points napped to surgical sharpness, leather pouches of dried roots and berries, dreams pressed like flowers between the pages of memory. The world is wild, but not unfamiliar. In fact, it is deeply, intimately known. Every stream and ridge, every seasonal change in the vegetation, every shift in animal behavior that signals weather or danger or opportunity. These people are not lost in the wilderness. They are home. Let us go quietly into one of these mornings. There is a settlement on the northern shore of a lake in what will someday be called the Jordan Valley. The place is now called Ohalo too, but to the humans who lived here 23,000 years ago, it is simply the place of water, reeds, birds, and fish, the place where the seasons speak clearly and the earth provides. The people wake to the liquid songs of cranes and the whispered conversations of insects. Dawn here doesn't break. It seeps across the sky like water soaking into fabric. Their shelters are brush huts, low dome-shaped constructions of branches and thatch that blend so perfectly with the landscape they seem to have grown from the earth itself. Inside, you find the careful organization of lives lived in small spaces. Grinding stones in one corner for processing wild grains, the fire pit in the center like a heart, ash swept carefully to the side, sleeping mats of woven grass worn soft with use. Against one wall, someone has stacked smooth river stones, perhaps for tool making, perhaps for some purpose we'll never understand. Nearby are animal bones, mostly gazelle and wild boar, cracked open for marrow, every calorie extracted with practiced efficiency. The hearth still glows warm, a constellation of orange embers breathing in the dark. Someone, maybe a grandmother who sleeps lightly, maybe a young adult proving their responsibility, has been feeding it through the night. Not by accident, not haphazardly, but with the kind of expertise that comes from a lifetime of practice. Making fire from scratch is hard work involving friction, patience, and perfect conditions. Keeping it alive is a skill that can mean the difference between comfort and catastrophe, between life and death. Here, fire is not just warmth or a way to cook food. It is the center of everything, the axis around which all life turns. Where there is fire, there is safety from the dark and what moves within it. Where there is smoke, there is a signal to friends and a warning to enemies. Where there are glowing coals, there are stories and songs and the space for human souls to unfold. The world these people inhabit is not the hostile wilderness of modern imagination. It is a place of profound abundance, if you know how to see it, how to read its signals, how to move with its rhythms rather than against them. But this knowledge isn't written in books or stored in libraries. It lives in bodies, in the accumulated wisdom of generations encoded in gesture and habit, in the stories told around the fire, in the dreams that come in the deepest part of night, when the membrane between the living and the dead grows thin. As the sky lightens from black to indigo to the palest blue, as the first birds begin their morning chorus, as the dew forms like a million tiny prayers on every blade of grass, another day begins in the long history of humanity. A day without writing, without agriculture, without monuments to human ambition, but a day nonetheless full of meaning, of small necessary tasks, of connections maintained and memories made. This is where our story begins, not with kings or conquests, but with the simple act of waking, of feeding a fire, of facing another day, in a world both utterly foreign and intimately familiar. Because before we built walls, before we planted seeds, before we carved our names into stone, we were this. Small groups of humans around fires, bound together by need and knowledge, living inside the rhythm of a world we had not yet learned to break. They did not have notebooks bound in leather or papyrus. They did not use spreadsheets to track the moon's phases or record seasonal variations in bark thickness or document the migration patterns of caribou herds. But the people of 10,000 years before the Common Era knew the land more intimately than most of us know the layout of our own homes. They moved through forests, across river banks, along windswept plains, not with a sense of domination or conquest, but with the fluency of long familiarity, the way a musician's fingers know their instrument, the way a mother knows her child's breathing in the dark. Their lives did not extract from the earth like miners pulling ore from stone. They conversed with it, participated in an ongoing dialogue that had been refined over hundreds of generations. Which berries appeared first after the spring melt, sweet and purple on southern slopes? Which tubers released their toxins only after being boiled twice, transforming from poison to nourishment? Which birds called before rain, their voices shifting in pitch with the barometric pressure? Which mushrooms grew only where lightning had once touched soil, as if the sky had planted secrets in the earth? They did not memorize this information to pass a test or earn a degree. They lived it, breathed it, became it, because to not know was to not eat, and to not eat was to not survive. For the Paleolithic human, knowledge of the land was not a hobby pursued on weekends or a skill listed on a resume. It was inheritance, apprenticeship, and devotion rolled into one seamless practice of being alive. Here's what's strange and humbling. They remembered all of it. For hundreds of thousands of years, Homo sapiens survived in environments ranging from snow-choked tundra, where breath froze before it left your lips, to equatorial jungles where the air itself seemed to sweat. They thrived not by building machines or stockpiling grain in vast warehouses, but by knowing deeply, bodily knowing. They knew plants not as entries in a field guide, but as relationships. This one flowers after the third rain, that one's roots grow deepest where the soil smells of iron. This one's leaves fold at night, like hands in prayer. They knew stones not as dead objects, but as potential tools sleeping inside rocky wombs, waiting to be born through the midwifery of skilled hands. A nodule of flint wasn't just a rock. It was a future knife, scraper, arrowhead, each tool already present in the stone's crystalline structure, visible to eyes trained to see possibility in the raw materials of the world. They knew the land not as scenery to be photographed, but as an epic poem written in the languages of season and scent, growth and decay, presence and absence. Modern archaeology offers us glimpses into this world, not through written records, but through microscopic traces that survived the millennia. A single tooth from a woman who died 30,000 years ago can tell us what she chewed. The tough fibers of roots, the grit from stone-ground seeds, the occasional sweetness of honey stolen from wild bees. Scraps of pollen preserved on a flint blade reveal when it was last used. What season, what flowering cycle, what hope or hunger drove the hand that held it. Residue caught in the grooves of a grinding stone whispers which seeds were crushed on its surface, which were discarded, which were precious enough to pursue. These are not guesses or romantic projections. These are chemical footprints, verified and peer-reviewed, that reveal a stunning truth. The Paleolithic world was not one of brutal scarcity, of desperate humans scraping survival from a hostile earth. It was a buffet, a wild, unplanted, uncultivated abundance that fed those who knew how to read its menu. And humans learned to read it like sacred scripture, like love letters from the earth itself. The old stereotype says men hunted while women gathered, a clean division of labor that appeals to our modern desire for simple categories. Reality, as usual, was far more complicated and interesting. Yes, males often focused on larger game, particularly in environments where strength and explosive power aided the kill. But women were not passive pickers of berries, following behind the mighty hunters with woven baskets and downcast eyes. They were the ecological anchors of the group, the living libraries of botanical knowledge. They knew where edible plants grew, yes, but that was just the beginning. They knew which trees healed wounds with their bark, which roots induced vomiting to purge poison, which leaves numbed pain when chewed. They understood the seasonal choreography of plants, when to harvest before seeds grew bitter, when to dry leaves for winter medicine, when to follow bees through the forest canopy, to find the hollow trees where sweetness lived. Their knowledge was not linear, proceeding from cause to effect in neat sequences. It was a living web, multidimensional and dynamic, a map drawn not on paper but in the mind's eye. You walked it, you sang it, you handed it down like an heirloom more precious than gold, because gold couldn't cure your child's fever or show you where water lay hidden beneath dry ground. Studies of dental calculus, the hardened plaque on ancient teeth that preserves like stone, have revealed extraordinary details about this knowledge in action. At El Sidrón in Spain, humans who lived 49,000 years ago carried traces of yarrow and chamomile in their teeth. These are not major calorie sources. They don't fill bellies or provide quick energy. They are medicines, yarrow for wounds and bleeding, chamomile for inflammation and anxiety. This suggests not just consumption but intent, not just eating but healing. Someone knew which plants eased which pains, and they knew it well enough to seek them out, prepare them, consume them with purpose. Other remains show traces of water lilies, which contain natural psychoactive compounds. Were these chewed in rituals, in vision quests, in moments of grief or celebration? We don't know the context, but we know it was not random. You don't accidentally eat the one water lily in the pond that alters consciousness. You learn, you remember, you choose. Then there's the residue on tools themselves, the ghost of ancient chemistry. A stone blade found in Border Cave in South Africa, dated to around 44,000 years ago, carried remnants of poison, a complex compound made from castor beans mixed with other plant extracts. This wasn't splashed on accidentally. It was carefully prepared, precisely applied, deadly effective. Someone knew not only which plants could kill when eaten, but how to concentrate their toxins, how to combine them for maximum potency, how to apply them to arrows that would bring down prey too dangerous to approach. That is chemistry. That is pharmacology. That is a science grounded not in laboratories but in generations of careful observation, experimentation, and teaching. The person who made that poison understood plant alkaloids and their effects on mammalian nervous systems. They just understood it through a different epistemology, one based on practice rather than theory, on embodied knowledge rather than abstract principles. Much of this knowledge moved through women, not because of some essential feminine connection to plants, but because of practical realities. Women spent more time gathering, yes, but also because they were often the ones tending children, nursing wounds, preparing food, observing the slow seasonal shifts in the living world. While hunters might be gone for days following a herd, the women remained, watching which plants the children put in their mouths, noting which caused rashes or stomach pain, remembering for next time. Modern forager societies offer windows into how this might have worked. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, women routinely identify hundreds of edible plant species, but their knowledge goes far beyond simple identification. They know that certain tubers are sweeter after the first rains, that others grow largest in the shade of particular trees, that some can be eaten raw, while others require specific processing to be safe. Their spatial memory is extraordinary. They can return to a specific tree across miles of seemingly identical landscape, remembering not just its location, but the quality of its fruit in different years. The Jew, Hoanzi of the Kalahari, possess similarly encyclopedic knowledge. Women know which roots provide water in the dry season, which seeds can be stored for months without spoiling, which leaves repel insects when rubbed on the skin. This isn't trivia or specialized knowledge. It's the accumulated wisdom that allows life to continue in challenging environments. And it's held not in books but in bodies, passed not through lectures but through walking together, hands touching plants, stories weaving knowledge into memory. There's no single Paleolithic world, of course. The diets and strategies of humans living near the coast of what is now Japan looked very different from those roaming the interior of Europe or the savannas of Africa, but everywhere the pattern holds: a sophisticated synthesis of local knowledge, seasonal awareness, and collective memory that allowed our ancestors to thrive in environments we would consider impossibly challenging. At Ohalo II in the Levant, archaeologists found traces of over 100 plant species, an astonishing diversity that speaks to the breadth of Paleolithic knowledge. Wild wheat, barley, figs, acorns, and dozens of others, some charred from cooking, others carefully stored. These people were not stumbling through the landscape hoping to find food. They were managing it with intention and expertise developed over millennia. They harvested before seeds dropped and were lost. They gathered before rot set in. They knew when, where, how, and how much. Some anthropologists now argue that Paleolithic foragers practiced a form of proto-agriculture, not farming as we know it, but actively tending the landscape. They encouraged the growth of useful species through selective gathering, burned certain areas to promote new growth, avoided overharvesting to ensure future abundance. This is supported by evidence from Australia, where Aboriginal peoples' fire stick farming shaped entire ecosystems for tens of thousands of years. Fire was not just for warmth or defense or cooking, it was a land management tool. Elegant, effective, and deeply rooted in ecological understanding. The right fire at the right time in the right place could transform a landscape, encouraging the plants that fed humans and the animals humans hunted, creating a mosaic of habitats that maximized biodiversity and productivity. And all of this vast, intricate, astonishing intelligence was passed down without writing. It moved through story, through song, through the patient repetition of hand over hand, season after season, through walking the same trails year after year and noticing what had changed, through watching your mother crush seeds on a grinding stone and learning when to add water, when to stop, how to know by touch and smell when the paste was ready, through stories that encoded ecological knowledge in mythic narratives, why the oak and the jay help each other, why the salmon return to the river where they were born, why you must always leave some berries for the birds. This kind of memory doesn't live in books or hard drives. It lives in muscles and neural pathways, in the body's own intelligence. It's the difference between reading about how to ride a bicycle and actually riding one. You can't learn this knowledge from a distance. You have to inhabit it, become it, live it with every sense engaged. This is not to romanticize the Paleolithic world as some kind of primitive paradise. There was hunger, disease, injury, death. Knowledge could be lost if the elders died before passing it on, if climate changed faster than tradition could adapt, if conflict scattered the group that held specific memories. But it is to say this: they were not ignorant. They were not fumbling through darkness, waiting for civilization to dawn. They were tracking stars, mapping rivers, sharing knowledge, managing ecosystems, and telling stories that carried more practical data than any encyclopedia. Their intelligence was not lesser than ours. It was different. Where we prize abstraction, they valued integration. Where we separate knowledge into disciplines, they wove it into unified understanding. Where we store information outside our bodies, they embodied it so completely it became part of their being. They were generalists in the deepest sense, not people who knew a little about everything, but people for whom everything was connected, each piece of knowledge supporting and illuminating the rest. To forget which berry poisoned or which root soothed was to risk not just your own life but your group's survival. So they didn't forget. They remembered everything. They told it again and again, wove it into songs that were easy to remember, into stories that children begged to hear, into rituals that encoded practical knowledge in sacred form. The world was not wilderness to them, a word that implies separation, otherness, danger. It was home. It was kin. It was the great teacher that never stopped offering lessons to those who paid attention. Perhaps that's the strangest and most humbling thing to realize from our vantage point 10,000 years in the future, that people with no written language, no cities, no schools, no libraries, no internet, still knew more about their local ecosystem than most of us know about the places we've lived our entire lives. Their knowledge didn't come from conquest or domination or the imperial ambition to catalogue and control. It came from continuity, from humility, from the deep patience of paying attention across generations. It came from reverence, not the reverence of worship from a distance, but the reverence of intimacy, of knowing something so well that you see its sacredness in every detail. They carried everything they needed to know, not in books or bytes, but in the elegant storage system of human memory reinforced by human community. Every adult was a walking library, every elder a university, every child a student absorbing through every sense, and every evening around the fire, the knowledge was renewed, refined, shared, and secured for another day. They were not waiting for us to invent intelligence. They were already living it, breathing it, being it, an intelligence so sophisticated we're only beginning to understand its depths, an intelligence that saw the world not as a collection of resources to be exploited, but as a web of relationships to be maintained, an intelligence that knew the deepest truth, that knowing and being are not separate activities, but one continuous practice of staying alive, staying connected, staying human. The caveman is a myth, not because humans never stepped into caves. They did, for shelter from storms, for ritual purposes, for the creation of underground galleries that still take our breath away, but the idea that they lived there permanently, generation after generation, grunting in the darkness under dripping stalactites like troglodytes waiting for evolution to invent suburbs, that's a modern fantasy. Part insult, part misunderstanding, part projection of our own fears about what life without permanent addresses might mean. The truth is softer, smarter, and far more elegant. Caves were Plan B, emergency shelters, seasonal retreats, natural refrigerators for storing meat. They were conference rooms for the sacred, not living rooms for the everyday. The real Paleolithic home was built with hands, memory, and whatever the land offered that season. These structures breathed, moved, decomposed, and were reborn, leaving barely a trace, which is perhaps why we've been so slow to see them for what they were. Architecture as sophisticated as any cathedral, just built from different principles. To understand where we truly slept before walls, we have to abandon our modern biases about what constitutes proper shelter. We have to stop looking for permanence and start seeing patterns. The archaeological record, when read with careful eyes, reveals not an absence of architecture, but a different philosophy of it entirely. Home wasn't a structure you built once and maintained forever. It was a practice, renewed each season, refined each generation, remembered in the body rather than preserved in stone. First, imagine life without permanence. No postal code to memorize, no property lines defended by lawyers, no mortgage weighing on your mind for 30 years. Life in the Paleolithic was mobile, seasonal, and pragmatic. People moved with the herds of reindeer when the lichen grew thin, with the spawning salmon when the rivers ran silver, with the ripening nuts when autumn painted the forests gold. Home wasn't a fixed point on a map. It was a relationship with the landscape, a dance between human need and natural abundance. At Terra Amata, perched on what is now the sun-drenched Mediterranean coast near Nice, traces of constructed dwellings dating back roughly 400,000 years tell a story written in post holes and ancient ash. These weren't caves carved by water and time. They were huts, deliberate, designed, human-made. Long and oval structures framed with wooden posts driven deep into the ancient beach sand. their walls likely made from branches interwoven like basket weaving, then covered with brush, leaves, or animal hides that breathed with the coastal wind. The evidence speaks in the language of discoloration. Dark circles in the soil where posts once stood, the ghostly outline of ancient engineering. Fire pits were placed with intention, always central but never exactly centered, allowing smoke to rise and exit, while heat radiated evenly to the sleeping spaces. This wasn't accidental. It was architectural intelligence, refined through trial and error across generations. Someone's grandmother discovered that placing the fire slightly off-center created better airflow. Someone's child noticed that angling the entrance away from prevailing winds kept the interior warmer. This knowledge accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer, until building a good shelter became as natural as building a good fire. But Terra Amata was just one note in a vast symphony of Paleolithic architecture. Travel east to Mezhyrich in Ukraine, to the frozen steppes of 15,000 years ago, and find something that seems impossible. Houses built from the bones of giants. Here, where trees were scarce as hope and wind could strip flesh from bone, humans constructed circular dwellings from mammoth skeletons, not haphazardly, not desperately, but with the careful intention of engineers working with unconventional materials. Hundreds of tusks, skulls, and long bones were arranged into walls and supports, fitted together like a three-dimensional puzzle that required both spatial intelligence and deep knowledge of skeletal anatomy. The mammoth skull, massive and domed, became a cornerstone. Tusks, with their elegant curves, formed arches. Leg bones, strong and straight, provided vertical support. Over this framework of ancient calcium, hides were stretched taut, then lightly covered with sod and earth for insulation. One structure measured more than 4 meters across and included a central hearth, whose fire must have danced strangely in the shadows of those bone walls. These weren't temporary lean-tos knocked together in desperation. The sheer labor involved in collecting, transporting, and assembling hundreds of mammoth bones suggests planning, cooperation, and intention to return. Ash layers in the hearths, built up like tree rings, indicate repeated use across multiple seasons, perhaps multiple years. The bones show wear patterns from being assembled and disassembled repeatedly. This was architecture designed not for permanence, but for persistence, structures that could be taken down when the herds moved on, then rebuilt when the seasons circled back. In the Pavlovian culture of Central Europe, dating to around 25,000 years ago, we find yet another architectural tradition. Here, in the cold shadows of advancing glaciers, people dug into the earth itself. Semi-subterranean dwellings were carved into lowest soil, their floors sunk below ground level to conserve heat, but these weren't crude holes. They were sophisticated responses to environmental challenges, with timber or bone frameworks supporting roofs of hide and sod, creating insulated spaces that stayed warm even when Ice Age winds howled above. The genius of these structures lay not in their materials, but in their understanding of thermodynamics. By digging down, they used the Earth's stable temperature as insulation. By covering the excavated floors with stones, they created thermal mass that absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. By orienting their entrances away from prevailing winds and toward the winter sun, they maximized passive solar heating millennia before anyone coined the term. These people understood physics through their bodies, through the accumulated wisdom of countless cold nights and bright mornings. What unified all these diverse architectural traditions wasn't material or style, but philosophy. Unlike modern housing, which cuts into the land and dominates it, Paleolithic shelters adapted to it. They were low impact by design, leaving little trace, not because their builders were incapable of permanence, but because permanence would have been a liability. When the seasons changed, when the herds moved, when the salmon run ended, you needed to move too. A house you couldn't abandon was a prison. This mobility shouldn't be mistaken for instability. On the contrary, their very impermanence was what made these communities so resilient. When floods came, you moved to higher ground. When droughts struck, you followed the water. You weren't trapped by foundations you'd spent years building. You carried your knowledge, not your mortgage. The dwelling itself became less important than the skill to build it again. The archaeological evidence shows something remarkable. Standardized patterns repeated across vast distances and time periods. Circular hearths at center. Sleeping areas arranged radially like spokes on a wheel. Entrances facing away from prevailing winds. Tool-making debris concentrated in one area, food preparation in another. These weren't random arrangements, but cultural templates, architectural DNA passed down through generations. Like a recipe known so well you don't need to write it down, these patterns lived in collective memory. At some sites, archaeologists have found evidence of structures being rebuilt in identical configurations, season after season, year after year. The same post holes reused, the same stones marking the hearth's edge, the same spatial organization maintained, even as the people and materials changed. This suggests that the knowledge of how to build was as conserved as any physical structure could be. The blueprint lived in minds and hands, not on paper. And what surrounded these dwellings tells us how they were truly lived in. Fire hearths darkened by countless meals, waste pits showing careful disposal patterns, tool caches buried for next season's return, sleeping areas worn smooth by bodies. These weren't just shelters from the elements. They were the stages for entire lives, for births that happened by firelight, for children who learned to walk on hide-covered floors, for elders who told stories while winter storms raged outside, for lovers who whispered in the darkness, for the sick who were tended, and the dead who were mourned. The shelters held the whole human experience, but lightly, temporarily. When spring came and it was time to move, the structures were abandoned without sentiment. The hides were rolled up, the best poles perhaps taken along, the hearthstones left for next year's return. What remained would decompose, would be reclaimed by the earth, would leave only the faintest trace for archaeologists to puzzle over millennia later. The land healed from their presence as quickly as skin heals from a gentle touch. This philosophy of impermanence shaped more than architecture. It shaped consciousness. When your home can be rebuilt in a day, you don't develop the same attachment to place that agricultural peoples would later feel. Your security comes not from walls but from knowledge, not from deeds but from skills, not from ownership but from relationships. You are at home anywhere you can build a fire and raise a shelter, anywhere your people gather, anywhere the land provides. We find the ghosts of these structures in the shadows they cast in ancient soil. Post holes appear as dark circles where wood decomposed and left different minerals behind. Patterns emerge from careful excavation. The curve of a wall, the space between sleeping areas, the central hearth that anchored everything. Sometimes we find the stones that weighted down hide covers, still arranged in telltale circles. Sometimes a floor of packed earth, compressed by countless footsteps, preserved like a photograph in soil. But mostly we find absence, the negative space where life happened, the void that once held warmth and story and safety. And perhaps that's fitting, because Paleolithic architecture was always more about the life it sheltered than the structure itself. It was a verb, not a noun, a practice, not a product. So the next time you hear the word caveman, picture instead someone digging post holes in soft loess soil, someone bending saplings into perfect domes, someone fitting mammoth tusks together with the precision of a master craftsperson. Picture hands that knew exactly how much tension a hide could take, exactly which woods bent without breaking, exactly where to place the fire for maximum warmth and minimum smoke. Picture intelligence that built homes from the materials at hand, that created comfort from knowledge rather than accumulation. They slept before walls, yes, but they slept well. They slept surrounded by kin, warmed by fires that never quite died, sheltered by structures that breathed with the wind and bent with the seasons. They slept knowing that home was not a place, but a practice, not a possession, but a skill, not a fortress against the world, but a temporary arrangement with it. And when morning came and it was time to move, they rolled up their worlds and carried them forward, leaving behind only the faintest trace in the earth. A few stones, some darkened soil, the ghost of a hearth. The land barely noticed they'd been there at all, which was, perhaps, the whole point. There were no calendars taped to cave walls, no Little League schedules, no parent-teacher conferences marked in red ink, no school bells sliced the day into artificial periods, no grade levels segregated children by manufacturing date, no flashcards taught colours that every child already knew from sunset and berry stains. And yet somehow, miraculously, if you believe the modern myth that children can't learn without classrooms, the species survived. More than survived. It thrived for tens of thousands of years, raising generation after generation of humans who could read the sky, heal with plants, track invisible animals, and remember stories word perfect across decades. In the Paleolithic world, time did not divide generations into neat categories. It wove them together like strands in a rope, each generation strengthening the next. A child was not a student waiting to become human. A child was a small human becoming larger, a shadow learning to cast its own light, a voice learning the songs that held the world together. Education happened not in a building, but in the breathing space between one generation and the next. This was parenting without clocks, teaching without curriculum, childhood without the strange modern notion that learning only happens in designated spaces at designated times. And still, somehow, every adult knew which plants healed and which killed, how to track a deer through snow where water lay hidden in dry seasons, how to read tomorrow's weather in tonight's sky. The knowledge passed like milk from breast to belly, like warmth from fire to skin, like stories from mouth to memory. In every Paleolithic band, parenting was not the isolated nuclear project we know today. It was a communal art, a shared investment in shared futures. Children were not possessions belonging to two parents. They were small members of the group, everyone's responsibility, everyone's joy, everyone's hope for continuity. The anthropological term is alloparenting, a system where caregiving is distributed across the group like heat from a central fire. But in practice, it simply meant that every adult was watching, every elder was teaching, and every child was held by many hands. When a baby cried in the night, it was not just one exhausted mother who stirred. Aunts, grandmothers, older siblings, unrelated friends, anyone might reach out to soothe, to nurse, to hold. The child grew up surrounded by faces, voices, touches, each one teaching something different about being human. From one uncle, the art of pressure flaking flint. From a grandmother, which roots ease a bellyache. From an older cousin, how to whistle like a quail. From the cranky elder by the fire, stories about why the stars arranged themselves just so. Contemporary hunter-gatherer groups offer us windows into this older way of raising humans. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, infants are rarely put down. They spend their first months skin to skin, passed from person to person, absorbing the rhythms of adult life through every sense. They hear negotiations and laughter, smell cooking food and tanned hides, feel the vibration of footsteps and voices. Their education begins before they can focus their eyes, a full immersion course in being human. Toddlers among the Hadza are not confined in playpens or supervised at every moment. They wander the camp edges, always within sight but free to explore. They put things in their mouths, stones, sticks, leaves, learning through taste and texture what belongs inside the body and what doesn't. When they venture too far, any adult might redirect them. When they cry from a scraped knee, whoever is nearest provides comfort. The child learns early that safety comes not from one source, but from many, that the whole world is watching out for them. By 4 or 5, children begin trailing adults on foraging expeditions. Not formally, not with lesson plans, but naturally, like ducklings following whatever adult seems to be doing something interesting. They carry miniature versions of adult tools, small digging sticks, child-sized baskets, tiny bows that couldn't kill a mouse. These aren't toys in our sense of the word. They're training equipment, scaled-down versions of real life. Among the Jew, Hoansi of the Kalahari, the practice is similar, but the stories are even richer. Every evening, as the fire burns low and the stars emerge like scattered seeds, adults tell stories. Not children's stories simplified and sanitized, but the real stories that explain how the world works. Why the mongoose is clever, why water must be shared, why the ancestors still walk with us, though we can't see them. Children don't sit in rows facing forward. They sprawl in the sand, lean against adults, play with small objects while listening. The stories sink in sideways, the way important truths often do. Archaeological evidence aligns beautifully with these ethnographic observations. At multiple Paleolithic sites, we find small tools that bear the telltale marks of learning. Scrapers with hesitant, uneven edges, blades with failed attempts at pressure flaking, points that would never pierce anything tougher than imagination. These aren't mistakes in the archaeological record, they're childhood preserved in stone, each imperfect tool, a snapshot of a young mind figuring out how hands and stones can work together. The wear patterns tell stories of patient teaching, an adult's skilled hands guiding smaller ones. The same mistakes repeated until suddenly they aren't mistakes anymore. We can trace the learning curve in lithic remains. Early attempts with too much force that shatter the stone, later tries with too little pressure that fail to remove flakes. Finally, the sweet spot where intention meets material and a proper tool emerges. Each broken piece represents not failure but education, not waste but investment in the future. But perhaps the most profound evidence of Paleolithic childcare comes from burials. At Sunghir in Russia, 2 children were laid to rest 34,000 years ago with more grave goods than many adults. One, a boy of about 12, was buried with thousands of ivory beads that would have taken months to create. A girl nearby was surrounded by ivory spears, Arctic fox teeth and carved figures. The sheer labor invested in their burial goods tells us these weren't disposable offspring. They were treasured members of the community, mourned deeply, remembered elaborately. At Kafsa Kave in what is now Israel, a child of about 6 was buried 90,000 years ago with deer antlers placed carefully around the body. At La Ferracie in France, a Neanderthal infant was laid in a shallow pit carved from bedrock, covered with a stone slab, an act of tender care that speaks across species and millennia. These children weren't just biologically produced and mechanically raised. They were loved, mourned, and carefully transitioned into whatever came after death. The presence of healed injuries in skeletal remains tells another story about care. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, archaeologists found the remains of an elderly man who had survived for years with severe disabilities. A withered arm, a damaged eye, a pronounced limp. Someone had fed him, protected him, included him in group movements despite his limited mobility. This same care extended to children. Bones showing signs of serious childhood injuries that healed completely tell us that when children were hurt, they were nursed back to health, not abandoned. Learning in this world happened through the body as much as the mind. Children learned the weight of water by carrying it. They learned the texture of edible plants by processing them. They learned the rhythm of tool-making by watching the same movements repeated thousands of times, then trying their own small hands at the task. This wasn't abstract education, it was apprenticeship in being alive. Time in the Paleolithic childhood wasn't measured in semesters or years, but in capacities. You were ready for certain knowledge when your body and mind could hold it. No one taught a toddler to track animals, their attention span couldn't sustain it. But by 6 or 7, children could follow simple trails. By adolescence, they could read the complex stories written in disturbed grass and broken twigs. The curriculum was the world itself, and readiness was obvious in the doing. There were no grades, but there were consequences. If you didn't learn which berries caused cramps, you suffered. If you couldn't make a basic cutting tool, you couldn't help process food. If you didn't listen to the stories about where water could be found in dry seasons, you might go thirsty. The feedback was immediate, visceral, meaningful. No one needed gold stars or report cards when survival itself provided assessment. We know from contemporary foraging societies that children in these contexts often learn faster and more thoroughly than their schooled counterparts. Not in reading or arithmetic, but in the skills their environment demands. A Hadza child can identify dozens of bird species by their calls before age 10. They know which trees fruit in which season, which insects bite and which are good to eat, how to find water-bearing roots in a drought. This isn't because they're inherently smarter, but because their education is integrated, immediate, and consequential. The skills came wrapped in stories that made them memorable. Why do we always leave some honey for the honey guide bird? Because long ago, when the first people were starving, the honey guide showed them where the bees hid their gold, and we must never forget that kindness. Why do we never camp under the sausage tree? Because its fruits fall like clubs in the night and can crack a skull. Here, feel how heavy they are. Every piece of crucial knowledge came embedded in narrative, making it stick in memory like pollen in fur. And play, that great teacher disguised as pleasure, was everywhere. Children made miniature camps with pebbles for people and twigs for shelters. They role-played hunts, with one child being the antelope, others the hunters. They practiced adult conversations, mimicking the cadence and concerns of their elders with startling accuracy. These games weren't separate from real life. They were rehearsals for it, ways of trying on adult roles while the stakes were still low. The gendered division of childhood was less rigid than we might assume. Yes, boys might spend more time with men and girls with women, absorbing the specific skills their future roles would require. But in a world where everyone needed baseline survival skills, all children learned to make fire, find water, recognize danger, prepare basic foods. Specialization could come later. Childhood was for building the foundation of competence that would keep you alive regardless of gender. Perhaps most importantly, children were not segregated from the realities of life. They saw birth and death, sickness and recovery, conflict and resolution. When animals were butchered, children watched and helped as their abilities allowed. When adults argued, children witnessed the negotiations. When someone died, children were present for the mourning. This might seem harsh to modern sensibilities, but it produced humans who were emotionally prepared for the full spectrum of existence. Mental health in these communities, insofar as we can infer it from contemporary hunter-gatherers, shows remarkably low rates of what we would call childhood anxiety or depression. Children who grow up embedded in multi-generational communities, who have responsibilities matched to their abilities, who see their contributions matter to group survival, tend to develop robust self-concepts and emotional resilience. They know their place in the world because they've been actively participating in it since they could walk. The Paleolithic childhood was not perfect. No childhood island. There was danger, disease, early death. There were harsh seasons and scarce resources. But there was also something we've largely lost. The sense of being essential, of being embedded, of learning through living rather than through artificial exercises. There was the security of many watchful eyes, many teaching hands, many patient voices explaining the world not as abstract concepts, but as lived reality. By the time a Paleolithic child reached what we would call adolescence, they were already competent humans. They could make tools, find food, build shelters, navigate landscapes, remember stories, tend wounds, read weather, track animals. They had absorbed through years of observation and practice what we try to cram into curricula. They were ready not for graduation but for greater participation, for taking their place as full members of the group. This education left no certificates, no transcripts, no standardized test scores, but it produced humans who could survive and thrive in environments we would find impossibly challenging. It produced the artists who painted Lascaux, the engineers who built Göbekli Tepe, the navigators who populated the Pacific, the storytellers who kept wisdom alive across millennia. It produced humans who saw learning not as something that happened in designated buildings during designated years, but as the continuous process of being alive. When we look at our own struggles with education, the stress, the standardization, the separation of learning from living, we might remember that for most of human history, childhood meant something different. It meant being held by many hands, taught by the whole world, measured by readiness rather than age. It meant growing up, not in preparation for life, but in the midst of it, not waiting to become human, but being human from the very beginning, just smaller, still learning, still becoming. The memory of this older way lives on in every child who would rather be outside than at a desk, who learns better by doing than by reading, who craves not just parents but a whole tribe to belong to. We are still, in our deepest programming, expecting a world where everyone teaches and everyone learns, where knowledge lives in bodies and stories rather than textbooks, where growing up means growing into a place already prepared for you around the fire. They raised humans without time, without schools, without any of what we consider essential for education. And those humans went on to populate the earth, to create art and music and story, to become the ancestors of everyone alive today. Perhaps there's something there worth remembering. When the sun sank beneath the ancient horizon and the sky became a canopy of memory, what emerged was not silence, but a different kind of life. Slower, closer, and full of meanings that daylight could never hold. In the year 10,000 before the Common Era, there were no streetlights bleeding orange into the darkness, no screens casting blue halos on tired faces, no clocks parceling out sleep in measured doses. But there was fire, and where there was fire, there was story and song, and the quiet rhythmic rituals that transformed a species of clever apes into something that could imagine gods. Night was not an interruption of the real business of living. It was the soul of the day, the time when the practical transformed into the sacred, when the scattered band became a single breathing organism gathered around the heartbeat of flame. For the humans of the late Paleolithic, fire was not merely a tool, though it cooked their food and warmed their bodies and kept the shadows at bay. It was a space without walls, a center that held without constraining, a circle of safety where imagination could unfurl like smoke into the star-drunk sky. The archaeological remains from sites scattered across continents tell this story in char and ash. At Kasem Cave, in what is now Israel, a hearth 400,000 years old shows evidence of repeated use, the same spot chosen again and again for the gathering of flames and people. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, traces of worked ochre dating back 75,000 years cluster near ancient fire pits, red pigment that may have decorated bodies, objects, or the cave walls themselves, all made visible and meaningful in the dance of firelight. This is crucial to understand. Fire didn't just provide light, it created a theatre. In the flickering orange glow, shadows became animate. A hand gesture thrown large against stone might become the wing of a bird, the reach of a predator, the movement of an ancestor. The play of light and dark turned the simple recounting of the day's events into something more: performance, art, education, and worship, all rolled into one. Around the fire, people told stories. Not the kind we know today with neat three-act structures and satisfying resolutions, but layered oral tapestries where myth, memory, warning, and wonder wove together like smoke. These stories served purposes we've divided into separate categories, but which once lived together. They entertained and educated, preserved practical knowledge, and explored existential questions, bound the group together, and explained why they were bound. A story about why the honey-guide bird leads humans to bee trees wasn't just amusing. It encoded a crucial symbiotic relationship that provided calories and medicine. A tale about the ancestor who learned to read tomorrow's weather in tonight's sky wasn't just family history. It was a meteorology lesson wrapped in narrative, making it memorable across generations. The stories weren't luxuries. They were technologies, as essential to survival as any stone tool. Firelight storytelling shaped the human brain in ways we're only beginning to understand. The focused attention required to follow a narrative, the memory systems needed to retain and retell complex stories, the social cognition involved in understanding different characters' motivations. All of these cognitive abilities were exercised and strengthened night after night, generation after generation. The hearth was humanity's first gymnasium, but instead of building muscle, it built the neural architecture for culture itself. But stories weren't the only sounds that filled the darkness. Music drifted through the night air like another kind of smoke. The flutes discovered at Hohlefels and Geissenkleisterle in present-day Germany, carved from vulture bone and mammoth ivory over 40,000 years ago, weren't rough approximations of instruments. They were sophisticated tools for making meaning from breath. Their holes were evenly spaced, their bodies shaped for optimal resonance. Someone had experimented with placement, with size, with materials, refining the design until it could produce not just notes, but music. When researchers have played reconstructions of these ancient flutes, they found they can produce pentatonic scales, the same five-note patterns that underlie musical traditions worldwide. This wasn't coincidence. It was convergent evolution of culture, human minds independently discovering the mathematical relationships between sounds that please our ears and move our hearts. The Paleolithic night resonated with melodies we would recognize as hauntingly familiar, played on instruments older than any city. Alongside the flutes came percussion, drums of hide stretched over wooden frames, rattles of gourds filled with seeds, the rhythmic clapping of hands and stamping of feet. Some researchers have identified stones at various sites that show wear patterns consistent with being struck repeatedly, possibly serving as lithophones. Rocks chosen for their resonant qualities and played like prehistoric xylophones. The night had a heartbeat made of many drums, synchronizing the group's breathing, walking, thinking. And with rhythm came movement. Dancing wasn't recreational in the way we understand it, a fun activity for weekends or weddings. It was ritual, therapy, communication, and communion all at once. In many contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, dance serves as the primary method for achieving altered states of consciousness, for healing both physical and psychological wounds, for resolving conflicts without violence, for marking transitions from one life stage to another. The Jew, Hoansi of the Kalahari, still perform healing dances that may echo practices tens of thousands of years old. The dancers move in circles around the fire, their steps repetitive, almost hypnotic. Through the combination of rhythmic movement, hyperventilation, and intense focus, dancers enter trance states where they believe they can see sickness, pull it from bodies, and cast it into the fire. Whether or not we accept the metaphysical claims, the psychological and social effects are undeniable. The dances bond the group, release tension, and provide a framework for processing trauma and change. Language itself may have evolved as much in firelight as in daylight. The need to coordinate hunts and foraging expeditions certainly drove some linguistic development, but the explosion of symbolic thinking that characterizes behavioral modernity, the ability to talk about things that aren't present, to plan for futures that haven't arrived, to share dreams and fears and abstract ideas, this may have flourished in the safety and intimacy of the fireside circle. Consider what firelight does to communication. In the harsh clarity of day, words are often practical, focused on immediate needs and visible tasks, but in the soft obscurity of firelight, where faces flicker between visible and hidden, where the boundary between self and shadow blurs, language can venture into different territories. This is the time for metaphor, for exploring what things are like, rather than just what they are. This is when humans learn to talk about their inner worlds, making the invisible visible through words. The night mind differs from the day mind in ways that would have been even more pronounced in a world without artificial light. Melatonin rises, promoting not just sleep but a different kind of consciousness, more associative, less linear, more open to mystery. The stories told by firelight weren't just received differently because of the theatrical setting. They were received by brains in a different chemical state, more receptive to narrative leaps, to symbolic thinking, to the collapse of boundaries between self and story. And then there was the simple, profound fact of proximity. In the circle of firelight, bodies touched. Children sprawled across adults' laps. Lovers leaned into each other. Elders felt the warmth of younger bodies keeping the cold at bay. This wasn't just physical comfort. It was neurochemical communion. Touch releases oxytocin, synchronizes heartbeats, regulates nervous systems. The nightly gathering wasn't just cultural tradition. It was group therapy, hormonal regulation, and social bonding at the most fundamental biological level. The fire also served as humanity's first laboratory for altered consciousness. Staring into flames induces a light trance state. Researchers have documented changes in brain waves, reductions in anxiety, and increased activity in the default mode network associated with creativity and self-reflection. The random yet patterned movement of flames, the white noise of crackling wood, the warmth on skin, all of these combine to create what psychologists now recognize as optimal conditions for the kind of relaxed focus that promotes insight and innovation. This is where the sacred emerged, not in grand temples or elaborate theologies, but in the simple act of gathering in darkness around light. The fire was literally central, the physical middle of the camp, but it was also symbolically central, the axis around which all meaning revolved. It was the sun brought to earth, the place where the raw became cooked, the cold became warm, the dangerous became safe. It was transformer and transformed, eating wood and giving light, dying to embers, and being reborn each evening. The hearth shaped our ancestors' understanding of time itself. Days were punctuated not by clocks, but by the rhythm of fire building, fire tending, fire dying. Seasons were marked by changes in available fuel, by how long the fire needed to burn, by what stories were told during the longest nights. Years were remembered by what happened around particular fires. The winter when the stranger came and taught new songs, the summer when lightning provided fire without friction, the autumn when grandfather told the creation story for the last time. Even the archaeology of ash tells stories. Hearths at sites like Abric Roman in Spain show microscopic layers that reveal not just what was burned, but when and how. Fish bones in one layer, pine needles in another, telling tales of seasonal rounds and dietary changes. The careful maintenance of fires, banking coals under ash to preserve them overnight, selecting specific woods for specific purposes, shows a relationship with combustion that was both practical and reverential. We know from the placement of hearths that they were social spaces, not just functional ones. At Pinsfent in France, dating to about 12,000 years ago. Hearths are surrounded by clear activity areas, here for tool-making, there for food preparation, over there for sleeping. But the hearth itself was kept clear, a stage or altar around which life revolved, but which maintained its own sacred space. You worked near the fire, you slept near the fire, but the fire itself remained inviolate, tended but not trespassed upon. The end of the night brought its own rituals. As fires burned low and coals glowed like earthbound constellations, people settled into sleep. But not the isolated unconsciousness we know. They slept in groups, in piles, in contact. Children tucked between adults, dogs curled against human bellies, the elderly kept warm by younger bodies. The dying fire still provided a center, its fading light a comfort against the complete darkness that would soon arrive. But even in sleep, the fire's influence continued. Dreams came differently to minds that had spent the evening staring into flames, listening to stories where animals spoke and ancestors returned. The boundaries between waking and sleeping, between story and reality, between self and other, all these, were more permeable in a world where consciousness itself was shaped by firelight rather than electricity. This is what we've lost, and what we sometimes ache for without knowing why. When we light candles for dinner or gather around beach bonfires or feel inexplicably moved by the flicker of a fireplace, we're responding to programming laid down over hundreds of thousands of years. The fire is calling to something deep in our neural architecture, something that remembers when night was not empty time to be filled with entertainment, but sacred time to be filled with each other. The Paleolithic night was humanity's first university, its first theatre, its first temple. Around the fire, we became not just Homo sapiens, but humans. Creatures who could imagine, remember, and share worlds that existed nowhere, but in the space between mouth and ear, in the dance of shadow and light, in the place where flame meets darkness and makes both meaningful. You know that feeling when you stare into a campfire and everything just slows down? That ancient calm that washes over you as flames dance and wood whispers its transformation into light? Your dog knows it too. Watch them next time. How they circle 3 times before settling. How they position themselves between you and the darkness. How their eyes reflect the fire like small amber moons. They're remembering something older than memory. A pact written not in words, but in the shared warmth of 10,000 generations of nights exactly like this one. Somewhere in the slow-turning millennia before the Common Era, beneath birch trees and bone-colored moons, another creature began walking beside us. It was not summoned by a whistle or commanded by a leash. It was not tamed by force or bred into submission through cages and chains. It arrived the way all the best things do, slowly, mutually, through the patient accumulation of small choices that add up to transformation. In the year 10,000 before the Common Era, on the frost-bitten banks of rivers now forgotten, humans were still nomadic bands following seasons and herds. But archaeological sites like Bonn Castle in modern-day Germany tell us something remarkable. By this time we were already burying dogs, not as food, not as sacrificial offerings, but as companions. At Bonn Castle, the remains of a human and a dog were interred side by side, laid to rest with equal care. The dog, notably, showed signs of having survived canine distemper, a disease that would have left it helpless for weeks, unable to hunt, barely able to walk. Someone fed it through its illness. Someone cleaned it, kept it warm, chose its life over the easier path of abandonment. Someone loved it. In evolutionary terms, that act of mercy was monumental. It meant we were not just tolerating the presence of these proto-dogs. We were investing in them, seeing them as beings worthy of care beyond their immediate utility. The calories spent nursing a sick dog could have fed a child. The attention given to a dying animal could have been directed toward productive tasks. But somewhere in our Paleolithic hearts, We had already decided. These creatures were kin. The popular myths about domestication still echo with the tone of human triumph, as if our ancestors simply decided one day to tame the wild and the wild obeyed. But what actually happened was far more interesting. A dance of mutual choosing that changed both partners forever. The real story doesn't start with a human hand reaching out to pet a wolf. It starts with garbage. As human camps grew more successful at hunting and processing game, they produced something new in the landscape: predictable waste. Bones with scraps of meat, organs too tough for human teeth, the remnants of successful kills. For wolves living on the edge of survival, these refuse piles were buffets. But approaching them required something most wolves didn't possess: tolerance for human proximity. The bold ones, the calmer ones, the ones whose flight distance was just a little shorter, gained access to calories their warier packmates couldn't reach. This created an evolutionary pressure cooker. Over generations, the wolves that could tolerate human presence thrived. Not the most aggressive, they'd be driven off or killed. Not the most fearful, they'd never get close enough to benefit. But the ones in the middle, curious but not threatening, bold but not aggressive. Natural selection began favoring traits that would have been disadvantages in purely wild populations. Smaller teeth, shorter snouts, retained juvenile characteristics that made them less threatening to the strange bipeds whose scraps they shared. The humans, in turn, noticed these camp followers. Perhaps at first they were merely tolerated, like the ravens and vultures that also cleaned up after successful hunts. But then something shifted. Maybe it was a cold night when a wolf slept close enough to share warmth. Maybe it was the morning when wolves barking at the camp's edge alerted humans to approaching danger: bears, lions, or hostile strangers. Maybe it was watching wolf pups play and recognizing something familiar in their tumbling, their curiosity, their way of learning the world through games. What we know from the archaeological record is that by 15,000 years ago, we weren't just tolerating these animals, we were changing them. The bones tell the story. Shorter snouts appear, better suited for the varied diet of camp life than the specialized carnivory of wolf packs. Teeth grow smaller and more crowded as jaws shorten. Brain cases shrink slightly, not because dogs became stupider, but because they no longer needed the full suite of wild survival instincts. They had outsourced some of that cognitive load to their human partners. But here's what's beautiful and strange. We changed too. The partnership altered both species in ways we're only beginning to understand. Dogs developed muscles around their eyes that wolves lack muscles, that allow them to make expressions that trigger nurturing responses in humans. That puppy dog eyes look that melts hearts? That's evolution crafting a communication tool more sophisticated than any technology. When a dog raises its inner eyebrows and gazes at you, it's activating parenting instincts laid down in your mammalian brain long before you were born. And our brains responded. Modern neuroscience shows that when humans and dogs gaze at each other, both experience surges of oxytocin, the same hormone that bonds mothers to infants, the same chemical that builds trust between lovers. This isn't just sentiment, it's biochemistry. We didn't just domesticate dogs, we co-evolved a capacity for interspecies love that exists nowhere else in the animal kingdom with such intensity. The practical impacts were immediate and profound. Dogs could track prey wounded by human hunters, following blood trails invisible to our weak noses. They could corner animals, holding them until humans arrived with spears. They could carry packs, extending the range of human travel. They could stand watch while humans slept, their superior hearing and night vision serving as early warning systems. In the Arctic, they would eventually pull sleds across ice, making human life possible in regions that would otherwise be unreachable. But listing the utilities misses the deeper transformation. For the first time in history, humans had a relationship with another species that wasn't based purely on predation, competition, or avoidance. We had partners. We had beings that would choose to stay with us even when they could leave, that would defend our children as their own, that would mourn our deaths and be mourned in return. At Predmost, in the Czech Republic, a site dating to 27,000 years ago, archaeologists found dogs buried with mammoth bones placed in their mouths, a clear sign of ritual, of meaning attributed to these animals beyond their practical value. In Siberia, at the site of Elisevici, dogs were buried wearing decorative collars made from mammoth ivory. These weren't livestock marked for ownership. These were individuals, recognized and adorned, sent into whatever afterlife their humans imagined with provisions for the journey. The emotional archaeology is harder to excavate but no less real. Every human culture that developed alongside dogs shows the same patterns. They are named, they are mourned, they are incorporated into spiritual beliefs. They become psychopomps, guiding souls to the afterlife, guardians against evil spirits, companions in the hunt for meaning as much as meat. They enter our stories not as tools, but as characters, heroes, guides. What's extraordinary is how this relationship shaped human consciousness itself. Children growing up with dogs learn empathy across species boundaries. They practice caregiving with beings that can't verbally communicate needs, but express them through body language, teaching the deep attention that makes us more fully human. They experience unconditional loyalty. A dog doesn't care if you're successful, beautiful, or important. It cares that you're you. This may have been crucial for human survival and development. As we spread across the globe into new and challenging environments, dogs spread with us. They weren't cargo, they were companions, scouts, early warning systems, and sources of warmth both physical and emotional. In the coldest nights of Ice Age Europe, in the vast expanses of prehistoric Asia, in the journey across Beringia into the Americas, dogs were there, not because we made them come, but because they chose to stay. The archaeology shows they shared our lives completely. Their bones show the same dietary adaptations as human populations. When humans ate more fish, so did dogs. When humans relied on reindeer, dogs did too. They developed regional variations matching their human partners. They were buried in human cemeteries, sometimes with more care than humans themselves. At the site of Skatholm in Sweden, dating to 5000 BCE, some dogs were buried with grave goods, while some humans were not, suggesting these animals had achieved full personhood in the eyes of their communities. But perhaps the most profound evidence of this ancient bond is written in our genomes. Humans who lived with dogs developed different disease resistances, different social structures, different ways of understanding the world. We became more successful hunters, more secure sleepers, more effective travelers. But we also became something harder to measure, beings capable of deep connection across the species boundary, able to read the emotions in non-human faces, willing to share resources with creatures that could never repay us in kind. The dog didn't become human, could never become human. But in becoming dog, that unique creature that exists in the space between wild and tame, between wolf and person, it helped us become more ourselves. It showed us that communication doesn't require words, that love doesn't require explanation, that family can be chosen and expanded beyond the boundaries of biology. So when we look back to 10,000 before the Common Era, let us not see only stone tools and fire pits. Let us see the quiet shadow at the edge of firelight, the warm presence pressed against a sleeping child, the alert ears swiveling towards sounds human senses couldn't detect. Let us see the first interspecies friendship, born not from dominance, but from mutual benefit, sustained not by chains but by choice. The dog came to us from the wild, and we met it halfway. In that meeting, both species discovered something new, that survival could mean more than just staying alive. that companionship could cross any boundary, that love was not limited by the shape of the body that held it. Before we built temples or cities or civilizations, we built this: a friendship that would outlast empires, a bond that would survive every catastrophe, a shared warmth that continues to this day every time a dog curls up beside its human and sighs with ancient contentment. They chose us, we chose them, and in that choosing, we became who we are. Before the plough carved its first furrow, before the pyramid rose from sand, before we thought to write down the name of a king or carve the features of a human god, we painted animals. In ochre and charcoal, in manganese black and hematite red, on the secret bellies of limestone caves, we left behind not cities or civilizations but creatures, bulls with shoulders like storm clouds, horses flowing across stone like water, bison with breath you can almost see steaming in the underground cold, lions prowling through calcite curtains, mammoths processing across walls in herds that thunder silently through 30,000 years. These were not idle doodles scratched by bored hunters waiting out bad weather. They were declarations of something so profound we still struggle to name it. Something in the animal had power. Something in the act of painting it, of mixing pigment with spit and blood and fat, of crawling through narrow passages to reach the perfect surface, of working by flickering torchlight in spaces that had never known the sun, gave shape to a part of the human soul we hadn't yet learned to recognize in ourselves. In the great painted caves of Europe, Lascaux and Chauvet in France, Altamira in Spain, and dozens of others, we find humanity's first cathedrals. Not built, but discovered. Not constructed, but transformed. These caves were not living spaces. No hearths warmed their depths. No sleeping hollows were carved in their floors. No debris of daily life accumulated in their chambers. These were sacred spaces, entered for purposes that had nothing to do with shelter and everything to do with something harder to define. Call it ritual, call it art, call it the birth of the mythic mind. Chauvet, dated to around 30,000 years before the Common Era, holds some of the oldest and most sophisticated paintings ever discovered. Here, in chambers that require crawling through passages barely wide enough for a human body, our ancestors created a bestiary of the divine. The animals aren't simply depicted, they're conjured. Lions emerge from shadows with a few precise lines. Rhinoceroses charge across rough stone, their weight and momentum captured in pigment that still makes the heart race. Horses flow in herds, their bodies overlapping in ways that suggest movement, time, the endless cycle of seasons. The skill level stuns modern artists. These painters understood perspective, shading, the way to use the natural contours of stone to give dimension to their work. A bulge in the rock becomes a bison's shoulder. A hollow becomes a horse's eye. The cave wall isn't merely a canvas, it's a participant in the creation. Its geology incorporated into the mythology being born in pigment and firelight. But why? Why did humans who needed every calorie for survival, every moment for the practical work of staying alive, spend precious time and energy creating art in places where few would ever see it? Why crawl through darkness, risk getting lost in labyrinthine passages, work in spaces where breathing itself was difficult, all to paint animals on stone? One answer emerges when we consider not just what was painted, but where. The images appear most often in the deepest, most inaccessible parts of caves. At Lascaux, the famous Hall of Bulls requires navigating narrow passages. The most spectacular panels at Chauvet lie beyond crawl spaces that flood seasonally. At Rouffignac, painters worked in chambers, reached only by wriggling through gaps barely large enough for a child. This wasn't art for display, this was art for transformation. The journey into the cave may have been as important as the painting itself, descending into absolute darkness, leaving behind the familiar world of sky and wind and seasonal change, entering the earth's body through mouths of stone. This was a kind of death and rebirth. The cave was a liminal space, a threshold between worlds. What happened in its depths stayed in its depths, but those who emerged were changed. In the flickering light of fat lamps and torches, the paintings would have seemed alive. Fire makes stone breathe, makes shadows dance, makes stillness impossible. The animals wouldn't have appeared static as they do under the steady beam of modern lights. They would have moved, flickered, emerged and retreated with each shift of flame. This wasn't representation, it was resurrection. The painted hunt was eternal, always happening, never resolved. The bison always falling, never dead. The horses always running, never arriving. The absence of human figures is as telling as the presence of animals. When humans do appear, they're often therianthropes, part human, part animal. The famous sorcerer of Trois Frères wears antlers and a tail. The Lion Man of Hohenstein Stadel, carved 40,000 years ago from mammoth ivory, has a human body topped with a cave lion's head. In the caves, the boundary between human and animal dissolves. We see not portraits of the hunters, but meditations on the hunted. Not human dominance, but human participation in a world where every creature contained divine possibility. This points toward animism, the worldview that recognizes spirit, consciousness, intention in all things, not as metaphor, but as lived reality. The deer wasn't just protein on hooves. It was a being with its own purposes, its own connections to forces humans could sense, but not control. To paint the animal was to acknowledge its power, to enter into relationship with it, perhaps to apologize for the necessity of the hunt, or to ensure its return. Modern hunter-gatherers offer glimpses of how these relationships might have worked. The San of southern Africa, whose rock art traditions stretch back thousands of years, speak of entering trance states where the boundaries between human and animal dissolve. Shamans describe becoming the eland they've painted, running with the herd, seeing through animal eyes. The art isn't separate from the experience. It's a technology for achieving it, a door between worlds that stays open as long as the pigment lasts. The practice of painting in caves may have been tied to these shamanic traditions. The caves themselves induce altered states. The darkness, the silence broken only by dripping water, the disorientation of moving through unmappable spaces, the changes in air pressure and temperature. Add rhythmic chanting, drums echoing off stone, the hyperventilation of exertion or ritual breathing, possibly psychoactive plants, and you have ideal conditions for consciousness to shift, for the ordinary world to fall away, and something else to emerge. Some researchers have noted that many painted caves show evidence of resonance. Certain chambers amplify and transform sound in ways that would have seemed magical to people who had no concept of acoustics as physics. A whisper becomes a roar. A single voice multiplies into a chorus. Drums create standing waves that make the whole chamber vibrate. The caves were instruments, and playing them correctly could transport consciousness into realms where humans and animals merged, where time folded back on itself, where the mythic became real. The animals chosen for depiction weren't random. They were the great powers of the Paleolithic world, the massive herbivores whose migrations meant life or death, the predators who competed for the same prey, the creatures whose habits and habitats shaped human possibility. But they weren't shown being hunted, for the most part. They were shown being standing, running, breathing, mating. They were shown in their power, not their defeat. This reverence for the animal extends beyond Europe. In Sulawesi, Indonesia, paintings dating back 45,000 years show hand stencils alongside animals, as if humans were signing their presence without claiming dominance. In Australia, rock art traditions stretching back 40,000 years or more show the rainbow serpent, the creation being that is neither fully animal nor fully divine, but something that encompasses both. Everywhere humans went, they painted animals, and everywhere they painted them with a complexity that suggests not just observation, but participation. The paintings encode knowledge as well as reverence. The horses at Lascaux show seasonal variations in coat thickness. The bison at Altamira display accurate anatomical details that would be invisible from a distance, but crucial for understanding the animal's behavior. The reindeer at Font de Gaume show antlers at different stages of growth, encoding information about seasons and cycles. This wasn't fantasy, it was careful observation transformed into sacred knowledge. But it was also more than that. In painting the animal, humans were painting themselves, not their physical forms, but their consciousness, their dreams, their understanding of their place in a world where every breath was borrowed from the same wind that filled the lungs of horses and wolves. The caves were mirrors as much as galleries, showing not what humans looked like, but what they looked at, what they valued, what they couldn't live without. We modern humans, surrounded by our own images reflected back from every screen and surface, might find this focus on the animal strange. But for 95% of human history, this was the norm. We defined ourselves not in opposition to nature, but as part of it. We found the sacred not in separation but in participation. We discovered art not as decoration, but as technology for navigating the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds. The legacy of these cave painters extends far beyond art history. They established patterns that would echo through every human culture: the use of images to invoke presence, the journey into darkness as spiritual practice, the animal as messenger between worlds. They created humanity's first permanent statements of meaning, messages that have outlasted every empire, every philosophy, every god invented since. Standing in these caves today, even lit by electric lights and accessed by modern walkways, something still stirs. The animals still run across stone skies. The hunt still continues in its eternal present tense. The boundary between then and now, between us and them, between human and animal, still shimmers like torch smoke. We're still the same species that mixed pigment with spit and painted by firelight. We still dream of running with horses, still fear the lion in the darkness, still recognize something holy in the way a bison's shoulder catches the light. The caves remember what we've forgotten, that before we were human, we were animal, and that becoming human didn't mean leaving the animal behind, but carrying it forward, honoring it, painting it on the walls of our consciousness where it runs forever, never caught, never killed, always reminding us of what we were before we thought we were separate, special, alone. In their depths, the painted caves whisper the oldest truth. That art began not with human portraits but with animal presence, not with self-aggrandizement but with recognition of the other, not with dominance but with reverence. The gods of the first temples had hooves and claws, teeth and tails, and we painted them not because we had conquered them, but because we couldn't imagine a world without them. High atop a ridge in southeastern Anatolia, where the land rolls like frozen waves toward the horizon, something impossible waits beneath the dust. Long before the wheel rolled its first rotation, before the plough carved its first furrow, before anyone thought to press reed into clay to make the world's first written word, someone here carved a circle from stone. Not just any stones, monoliths, each weighing more than a car, each decorated with reliefs so sophisticated they could have been carved yesterday, each arranged with an architectural intelligence that should not have existed yet. This is Göbekli Tepe, and it has no right to exist in the 12th millennium before the Common Era. And yet it does, buried deliberately under its own ruins like a secret the earth itself decided to keep, until we were ready to remember what we had forgotten about our own becoming. When German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt first saw the site in 1994, he knew immediately he was looking at something that would rewrite history. The local farmers had been ploughing around these strange stones for generations, thinking them medieval cemetery markers. But Schmidt saw what others had missed. These weren't gravestones from 1,000 years ago. They were monuments from before monuments were supposed to exist, temples from before temples were possible, architecture from a time when humans were supposed to be nothing more than wandering bands of hunters picking berries and sharpening sticks. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the impossible. The oldest layers of Göbekli Tepe date to nearly 12,000 years ago. That's 6,000 years before Stonehenge would be imagined. 7,000 years before the pyramids would rise from Egyptian sand. But unlike those later marvels built by settled farmers with agricultural surplus and social hierarchies, Göbekli Tepe was built by nomads, hunter-gatherers, people who, according to everything we thought we knew about human development, should have been too busy surviving to even dream of moving mountains. But move mountains they did, without wheels to transport stones, without metal tools to carve them, without beast of burden to help with the lifting, without writing to coordinate the work, without any of the technologies we assume are necessary for monumental architecture. Yet somehow they quarried limestone pillars up to 16 feet high, carved them with elaborate reliefs, and arranged them in perfect circles that speak of planning, mathematics, and a shared vision we can only guess at. There is no evidence of permanent habitation at Göbekli Tepe. No houses nestle between the stone circles. No hearths warmed families through winter nights. No storage areas held grain because grain wasn't cultivated yet. No trash middens accumulated the debris of daily life. What we find instead are T-shaped pillars arranged in circular or oval enclosures, often with a pair of central monoliths that dominate the space like standing giants. These central pillars may have represented humans, gods, ancestors, or something that encompasses all three. Their arms are carved in relief along the sides, hands meeting at the front in what might be a gesture of prayer, protection, or simple presence. They stand not as mere stones but as beings, and around them, the smaller pillars gather like witnesses to something we've lost the language to describe. But it's what's carved on these pillars that truly stuns. Not crude stick figures or abstract symbols, but a menagerie of Paleolithic life, rendered with careful observation and artistic skill. Foxes prowl across the stone, their eyes still watchful after 12,000 years. Snakes wind between reliefs of aurochs and wild boar. Vultures spread their wings above scorpions and spiders. Lions and leopards stalk between carved gazelles. And strangest of all, headless human figures appear here and there, as if death, or transformation, was already part of whatever story these stones were telling. The fox appears most frequently, leading some archaeologists to wonder if it held special significance, a totem animal, a mythic guide, a symbol of the cunning needed to survive in a changing world. Snakes, universal symbols of death and rebirth, transformation and danger, slither across multiple pillars. Vultures, those conductors between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, spread their wings in poses that would echo through Near Eastern art for millennia. These weren't random decorations. The arrangements suggest narrative, mythology, a symbolic language we can glimpse, but not fully read. The artistry shows not just skill, but reverence. These animals were powers to be acknowledged, not just prey to be consumed or predators to be feared. The Paleolithic world lived and breathed through every carved line. But how could nomadic hunter-gatherers coordinate such a massive undertaking? The logistics alone boggle the modern mind. Each pillar had to be carved from living bedrock at a quarry site, then somehow transported to the hilltop. Conservative estimates suggest each stone would have required dozens of people to move. The entire complex would have taken hundreds of workers. They would have needed to be fed, organized, motivated. They would have needed shared purpose, shared vision, shared belief in something worth pouring years of labor into. This challenges everything about the assumed progression of human development. We've been taught that agriculture came first, creating surplus that allowed some people to specialize in non-food production. That surplus led to permanent settlements. Settlements led to social hierarchies. Hierarchies led to organized religion. Religion led to temples. Temples led to monuments. It was supposed to be a neat progression from simple to complex, from survival to civilization. But Göbekli Tepe suggests the arrow of causation might point the other way. Here we have a temple, unquestionably a ritual space, a monument to meaning rather than mere shelter, that predates agriculture by at least 1,000 years. What if it was the need to gather, to worship, to commemorate together, that first encouraged people to stay in one place long enough to notice that dropped seeds sprouted? What if the temple came first, and farming was just a way to feed the people who came to pray? Evidence supports this radical reimagining. Genetic analysis of modern wheat strains traces their origins to wild varieties that grew within sight of Göbekli Tepe. The region where humanity first deliberately planted seeds lies within walking distance of humanity's first temple. This can't be coincidence. The sacred landscape and the agricultural revolution occupy the same ground because they're the same story told from different angles. And there's evidence of feasting, massive feasting. The bones of hundreds of gazelles and aurochs have been found at the site, butchered with stone tools, cooked in communal events that must have drawn people from across the region. These weren't daily meals. They were gatherings, celebrations, ritual consumption that bonded communities and created the social networks necessary for projects like temple building. The feast and the faith were inseparable. Some scholars suggest Göbekli Tepe functioned as a kind of ritual center for a wide region, a place hunter-gatherer bands would journey to for seasonal gatherings, initiations, astronomical observations, or communion with whatever forces they recognized as divine. The lack of domestic architecture supports this. People came here for occasions, not for ordinary life. They came to participate in something larger than the daily round of survival. The site wasn't built all at once. Layer upon layer of construction shows centuries of use, modification, elaboration. Older circles were buried, and newer ones built on top. Styles evolved. The earliest pillars show the most naturalistic animals, while later ones trend toward abstraction. It's as if we can watch mythology being born, the slow transformation from observed reality to symbolic representation, from what is seen to what is meant. And then, most mysteriously of all, it was buried. Not destroyed by invaders or abandoned to slow decay, but deliberately, carefully, methodically buried. Layer after layer of rubble and earth were brought in. The circles were filled, the pillars covered, the entire complex hidden beneath an artificial hill. The process must have taken enormous effort, not much less than building it in the first place. Why? Some suggest it was an act of closure, a way of ending a sacred site that had served its purpose. Like indigenous peoples who break pottery at graves or burn possessions of the dead, perhaps burying Göbekli Tepe was a way of completing its spiritual function. Others wonder if it was preservation, hiding something precious from changing times or approaching threats. Still others see it as transformation, returning the temple to the earth from which its stones were born. Whatever the reason, the burial preserved Göbekli Tepe better than any museum could have. The backfill protected the carvings from erosion. The careful coverage prevented stone robbery. The deliberate interment ensured that when we finally found it, we would find it largely intact. The people who buried it gave us a gift across 12,000 years, the chance to see what they saw, to stand where they stood, to wonder at their wonder. But we've barely scratched the surface, literally. Ground-penetrating radar reveals at least 20 more circles still buried, waiting beneath the artificial hill. Each excavated enclosure reveals new complexities, new questions. Were these structures roofed or open to the sky? Did each circle serve a different function or represent different groups? What rituals were performed here, and why did they require such monumental settings? The implications ripple outward, disturbing our neat categories. If hunter-gatherers could cooperate on this scale, could conceive and execute projects of this complexity, could invest this much labor in something that produced no calories, then what else were they capable of? What other assumptions about primitive peoples need revisiting? What other monuments lie buried beneath hills we've never thought to excavate? Göbekli Tepe forces us to recognize that the need for meaning is older than the need for bread, that the human drive to gather in sacred spaces, to mark certain ground as different from all other ground, to invest labor in mystery, this is not a luxury of civilization, but perhaps its very seed. Before we were farmers, we were believers. Before we built houses, we built temples. Before we settled down, we reached up. Standing among these ancient pillars, even in their partially excavated state, you can feel something of what drew people here 12 millennia ago. The hilltop commands views in all directions. You can see the world spread out like a map, the curve of the earth visible at the horizon. The sky here is enormous, the stars at night almost close enough to touch. This is a place that makes you feel both small and connected, both mortal and part of something that outlasts mortality. The T-shaped pillars, with their carved arms and watchful presence, create defined spaces that feel simultaneously protective and exposed. Inside the circles, you're held. Outside them, you're in ordinary reality. The threshold between is palpable. Even now, even with tour groups and archaeologists and the scaffolding of excavation, something sacred persists. The stones remember their purpose, even if we've forgotten the words that explained it. Perhaps that's the deepest mystery of Göbekli Tepe, not how they built it or why they buried it, but what it meant to stand here when the paint was fresh on the reliefs, when the whole community gathered for feasts, when whatever rituals these circles were built for were living practices rather than archaeological puzzles. What songs were sung here? What stories told? What transformations achieved? We'll never know completely. The specific beliefs that drove the building of Göbekli Tepe are as buried as the site itself once was. But we can know this. 12,000 years ago, humans already understood that some things matter more than mere survival. That gathering in sacred space feeds a hunger that food can't touch. That the labor of creating beauty and meaning is never wasted, even if, especially if, it serves no practical purpose. They built their temple on a hill where earth meets sky, carved their prayers in stone, and when the time came, gave it back to the earth that birthed it. In doing so, they left us more than an archaeological site. They left us proof that the need for the sacred is older than civilization, that the human heart has always reached for something beyond the human, that even in a world without writing or wheels or walls, people knew that some spaces needed to be set apart, marked off, made holy by human intention and inhuman patience. Göbekli Tepe is not the first temple, it's merely the first we've found, but in finding it, we've found something essential about ourselves. We are the species that builds circles of meaning in high places, that gathers to feast and remember, that carves our dreams in stone and trusts the earth to keep them safe until someone is ready to understand. There is a story we keep telling ourselves, polished, smooth by repetition like a stone in a river, that the day we planted wheat was the day we began to rise, that when we traded the wandering life for fields, when we exchanged the wild grove for the fenced granary, we took a magnificent step forward into civilization, into progress, into the golden dawn of history. We tell it as a triumph tale, humanity conquering nature, bending the earth to our will, graduating from mere survival to something grander. But what if the seeds we sowed were laced with a sorrow we couldn't taste? What if, along with wheat, we cultivated anxiety, not all at once, not in a single harvest, but quietly over centuries? A slow trade of mystery for management, rhythm for repetition, memory for measurement. What if progress is just another word for forgetting what we gave up? This is the beautiful trap that opened in the 10th millennium, before the Common Era, when something irreversible began to shift in the hills and valleys of the Fertile Crescent. It started innocently enough, perhaps with someone noticing that grain dropped near the camp last season had sprouted into a convenient patch, perhaps with the decision to stay a little longer near that patch, to protect it from birds and competing humans. Perhaps with the first time someone took a digging stick and made intentional furrows in the earth, planting not hope but certainty. In the archaeological layers of places like Atalyek and Jericho, we find the physical remnants of this shift. Storehouses filled with grain, mud brick homes built to last not seasons but generations, walls that hold and divide, marking the birth of mine and yours, inside and outside, us and them. Here humans stopped moving with the land's rhythms and began trying to make the land move with theirs. In doing so, they changed more than their diet. They changed their minds, their bodies, their relationships with time itself. Before agriculture, Paleolithic humans lived within cycles as natural as their own breathing. They hunted when animals were fat, gathered when plants were ripe, moved when resources grew thin. Their diet was a symphony. Hundreds of different foods across the seasons. Tubers and fish, fruits and nuts, eggs and honey, wild game and greens. Studies of dental remains and bone chemistry from pre-agricultural sites show something remarkable. Excellent nutrition, low disease rates, strong bodies adapted to movement and variety. Their days were structured not by the tyranny of the field, but by the conversation between human need and natural abundance. They worked hunting, gathering, processing, crafting. But anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherers suggest they worked less than we do. 20 to 30 hours a week of subsistence activities, the rest devoted to what economists would call leisure, but which was really the stuff of being human. Stories, songs, gossip, play, the elaborate construction of meaning from the raw material of existence. But with agriculture came a new kind of time, and with it, a new kind of person. The cyclical time of seasons remained, but overlaid on it was linear time, the time of planning, of investment, of delayed gratification taken to extremes our bodies had never known. You plant in spring and harvest in fall. In between you tend, you worry, you watch the sky with new eyes. Not the eyes of a reader of weather, but the eyes of someone whose life depends on forces they can influence, but never control. The first farmers probably had no idea they were conducting an experiment that would reshape the human condition. They were just trying to ensure dinner. But agriculture is a jealous partner. Fields demand attention. Crops create calendars. Surplus enables population growth, and population growth demands more fields, more crops, more surveillance of the demanding earth. What began as a sideline to foraging became the main event, and then the only event. With sedentism, the choice to stay in one place and make it yield, came transformations both obvious and subtle. The obvious ones fill archaeology textbooks: permanent architecture, pottery for storing grain, grinding stones for processing seeds, eventually irrigation systems and plows and all the hardware of agricultural life. But the subtle changes were perhaps more profound. First came ownership. When you invest months of labor in a field, you develop a new relationship with that piece of ground. It's not just where you happen to be this season. It's yours, requiring defense against both human and animal competitors. The concept of territory, fluid and negotiable in foraging societies, hardened into property. With property came inequality. Some fields are better than others. some farmers more successful, some families able to accumulate while others struggle. Skeletal remains tell the story in calcium and worn cartilage. Early agricultural populations show signs our ancestors didn't. Repetitive stress injuries from grinding grain, compressed spines from carrying heavy loads, arthritis in joints subjected to the same motions day after day. Teeth tell their own tale. Cavities become common as starchy grains. Replace varied diets. Enamel wears down from grit in stone-ground flour. Ironically, the food security agriculture promised came with nutritional insecurity. More calories, yes, but from fewer sources. The varied feast of the foraging life compressed into a monotony of grain, and more grain. Disease found new opportunities in sedentary life. When humans live in one place, their waste accumulates. When they live with domestic animals, pathogens jump species. Measles from cattle, influenza from pigs, a whole catalogue of miseries that had never troubled nomadic bands. Population density created perfect conditions for epidemics. The archaeological record shows settlements suddenly abandoned, sometimes with evidence of hasty burials suggesting catastrophic disease events. But perhaps the deepest change was psychological. Agriculture demands a relationship with time that foraging doesn't. You must plan not just for tomorrow, but for next season, next year. You must calculate how much to plant, how much to store, how much to trade, how much to save for next year's seed. The mind becomes a constant calculator, anxiety its baseline state. With surplus came a new kind of human, the specialist. When not everyone needs to produce food, some can focus on other things. Pottery, metalworking, priesthood, war, social stratification, almost unknown in foraging societies, emerged like weeds in the furrows. Chiefs, priests, craftspeople, farmers, slaves. The human family fractured into hierarchies that would have baffled our ancestors. Jericho, one of the world's first true towns, tells this story in stone and bone. By the 9th millennium before the Common Era, it boasted thick walls, not just for flood control, but for defense. Someone had something worth taking, and someone else was willing to take it. The walls speak of a new psychology, us inside, them outside. Safety through separation rather than through movement. The fortress mentality was born. Inside those walls, life organized itself in ways that would have seemed alien to the foragers who still roamed beyond them. Houses were packed together, privacy sacrificed for protection. The dead were buried beneath floors. Ancestors kept close, but also controlled. Their spirits managed like any other resource. Shrines appeared, but unlike the open-air sacred sites of the Paleolithic, these were enclosed, roofed, owned. Even the gods were being domesticated. At Atalyik in central Anatolia, dating to around 7,500 BCE, we see this new way of living in full flower. Houses built so close together that people entered through the roof, creating a human hive. Beautiful murals and sculptures show the aesthetic possibilities of settled life, but also its anxieties. Vultures picking at headless corpses, bulls, wild aurochs domesticated into cattle, dominating interior spaces. The wild hasn't been forgotten, but it's been brought inside, controlled, mounted on walls like trophies or warnings. The skulls tell their own story. At both Jericho and Atalyik, we find plastered skulls, human heads removed from bodies, covered with plaster to recreate faces, sometimes with shells for eyes. Ancestors transformed into objects, portable memory, controllable presence. The dead no longer return to the earth, but are kept, managed, displayed. Even memory becomes property. This new world brought genuine benefits. Agricultural surplus allowed population growth. Permanent settlements enabled accumulation of goods and knowledge. Specialization led to technological innovation. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture. All the achievements we associate with civilization have their roots in the soil of the first fields. We couldn't have Beethoven without bread, Shakespeare without surplus, moon landings without the millennia-long trajectory that began with planted seeds. But we paid for these achievements with coin we're still counting. The anxiety that comes from depending on forces you can't control, weather, pests, soil depletion, the diseases of density and domestication, the hierarchies that turn humans into resources, the walls, physical and psychological, that divide the world into mine and yours, sacred and profane, wild and tame, the sense, growing stronger with each generation, that we are separate from nature rather than part of it. The Neolithic Revolution wasn't a sudden event, but a slow seduction. Each step made sense in its moment. Stay a little longer to protect the grain patch. Build a shelter that lasts. Store surplus against hard times. Defend what you've stored. Accumulate advantages for your children. Each choice perfectly rational, together forming a trap we're still trying to understand. Contemporary hunter-gatherers, when asked why they don't farm, often respond with puzzlement. Why would anyone work that hard? Why chain yourself to one place? Why eat the same foods day after day? Why create the anxieties of ownership when the world provides enough for everyone? They look at agricultural life and see not progress but a kind of madness, the voluntary assumption of burdens their ancestors were wise enough to avoid. But by the time the trap was visible, it had already sprung. Population growth enabled by agriculture meant there was no going back. The land couldn't support everyone as foragers anymore. The ratchet only turned one way. Each generation inherited the choices of the previous one, each innovation creating new dependencies, new problems requiring new solutions, the whole system growing in complexity like a crystal in solution, beautiful and imprisoning at once. The metaphor of the fall, found in so many agricultural mythologies, perhaps remembers this transition. Eden wasn't a place but a way of being, the forager's world, where food grew without planting, where humans walked with gods, or spirits, or the animate forces of the living world, where the curse of agricultural labor hadn't yet fallen. The expulsion from paradise wasn't punishment but consequence. Eat from the tree of agricultural knowledge, and you'll earn bread by the sweat of your brow forever. We are still farmers, even those of us who have never touched soil. We live by the clock agriculture created, work the schedule's surplus allows, suffer the anxieties ownership brings. We build walls around our homes, our hearts, our sense of who deserves what. We accumulate against future scarcity, create hierarchies of value, separate the sacred into buildings and books rather than finding it everywhere. We've forgotten how to move with the world's rhythms, insisting instead that the world move with ours. The beautiful trap worked. We are its children, numerous beyond our ancestors' imagining, capable of wonders they couldn't dream. We've built cities that scraped the sky, sent our voices across the void, split the atom and decoded the genome. All of it growing from seeds planted 10,000 years ago by hands that couldn't imagine what they were setting in motion. But on quiet nights, when the walls feel too close and the clock too loud, something in us remembers. We go camping to taste the old life. We feel peace in forests and anxiety in cities. We struggle with the diseases of abundance, obesity, diabetes, depression that our ancestors never knew. We create apps to remind us to move, to breathe, to connect with others, all the things that once came as naturally as sunrise. The Neolithic trap was beautiful because it promised so much and delivered it all. Security, progress, culture, knowledge, the whole magnificent edifice of civilization. But it was a trap because it also took things we didn't know we'd miss until they were gone. The freedom of movement, the democracy of the band, the knowledge written in the body instead of books, the gods that lived in everything instead of designated spaces, the time that circled like seasons instead of marching like soldiers. We can't go back. The 10 billion humans currently alive can't become foragers again. The math doesn't work. The knowledge is fragmented. The world has changed too much. But we can remember. We can honor what was lost even as we navigate what was gained. We can build bridges between the forager's wisdom and the farmer's power, creating ways of life that honor both inheritance. The seeds we planted grew into more than grain. They grew into us, modern humans, products of the Neolithic revolution, still carrying Paleolithic hearts. The trap was beautiful because it made us what we are. It was a trap because it also unmade something precious. And we're still 10,000 years later trying to figure out what to do about it. In the beginning, time did not tick. It circled like smoke from the fire, spiraled like shells on the beach, returned like the migrating birds who knew their way without maps or calendars. It pulsed through the seasons and braided itself into wind patterns, animal migrations, and the moonlit logic of memory that needed no numbers to keep track of what mattered. Time was a living thing, breathing with the world's breathing, and humans lived inside it like fish in water, unaware there could be any other way to swim. But somewhere between the soft dawn of the 8th millennium before the Common Era and the sharp outlines of what we now call civilization, time changed. It hardened like clay in fire. It straightened like furrows in a field. It stopped being something you danced with and became something you raced against. It became a column, a schedule, a shadow cast by the grain silo and the tax ledger. And though wheat may have nourished our growing populations, it also seeded something more invisible and irreversible: the calendar. And with the calendar came the slow collapse of the mythic mind. For tens of thousands of years, time was mythological. Events didn't happen once and disappear into history. They happened eternally, renewed with each telling. The rains returned because the sky serpent shed its skin. The salmon came back because the first salmon had made a promise. The antlers grew and shed and grew again, because death was always followed by birth, as surely as winter was followed by spring. Stories explained seasons, but more than that, they collapsed the distance between then and now, making all time, present time, all ancestors, current company, all futures already foretold in the turning of the cosmic wheel. In this mythic time, a grandmother telling a story about her grandmother was not reaching back into the past. She was bringing the past forward, making it live again in the firelight. The ancestor wasn't gone but transformed, accessible through memory and ritual, dream and dance. Linear progression, the idea that time moves from past through present to future, like an arrow shot from a bow, would have seemed as absurd as suggesting that a river flows only once. But with the Neolithic revolution came new demands, and those demands reshaped consciousness itself. When you plant seeds, you enter into a contract with linear time. The seed you plant in spring is not the grain you harvest in fall in some eternal mythic sense. It's a specific seed in a specific field requiring specific days of growth. You can't plant whenever the spirit moves you. You must plant when the season demands, and seasons demand counting. The agricultural calendar emerged not as an abstract intellectual achievement, but as a survival necessity. Miss the planting window and starve. Harvest too early and the grain won't keep. Too late and rain might rot it in the field. Time became a tyrant dressed as a teacher, demanding precision where approximation had always sufficed. The moon's phases, once poetry, became accounting. The sun's journey, once divine drama, became agricultural algorithm. At sites like Nabta Playa in the Nubian desert, stone circles mark astronomical alignments from as early as the 5th millennium before the Common Era. These weren't just star maps, they were time machines, designed to capture and predict the movements of celestial bodies that determined when the rains would come, when the flooding would recede, when the earth would accept seeds. The sacred and the practical merged, but increasingly on practical terms. The sky became a clock face, and humans learned to read time's handwriting in the stars. The psychological effects were as profound as they were gradual. To live by the calendar was to become conscious of deadlines, a word that originally meant the line around a prison beyond which inmates would be shot. Agricultural time created its own prison, invisible but inescapable. You were no longer free to move when resources grew thin because you were invested, literally planted, in a specific place. The land owned you as much as you owned it. With fixed territories and predictable harvests came the possibility of debt, another invention that required linear time to make sense. In the fluid world of foraging, sharing was immediate and reciprocal. I give you meat today because you gave me honey last week and might give me roots next month. The cycle of giving and receiving was continuous, unmeasured, trusted to balance over time, like everything else in nature. But grain can be stored, counted, measured, surplus can be calculated, and once you can calculate, you can loan. I give you a bushel of grain now, you give me a bushel and a half after harvest. Time becomes commodity, interest its offspring. The mythic sense of abundance, that the world provides what's needed when it's needed, gives way to the anxious arithmetic of never having enough. By the third millennium before the Common Era, we see this new consciousness crystallizing into writing itself. And what was humanity's first written language used for? Not poetry, not prayers, not love letters. Accounting. The earliest cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, record grain distributions, livestock counts, labor obligations. The sacred stories that had bound communities for millennia remained oral, while the profane business of managing surplus rushed into symbol. We wrote down what we couldn't trust to memory, and what we couldn't trust to memory was the new world of measurement, deadline, and debt. Temple complexes, which began as places where the sacred calendar aligned human activity with cosmic rhythm, transformed into administrative centers. The priests who once mediated between human and divine became accountants, mediating between surplus and scarcity. The ziggurats reached toward heaven not just in architectural ambition, but in bureaucratic complexity. Layer upon layer of administration rose with the mud bricks, each level further from the earth, further from the mythic ground of being. Even the gods changed. Where once every stream had its spirit, every grove its presence, now gods became specialists. A god of grain, a god of the storehouse, a god of contracts. The divine, once ambient as air, compressed into job descriptions. Sky gods became kings, earth goddesses became fertility functions, and the wild sacred tangle of the animate world sorted itself into pantheons as hierarchical as any human palace. Time itself developed hierarchy. Sacred time, the time of festivals and rituals, separated from profane time, the time of work and obligation, where once every moment could shimmer with potential meaning, now meaning was scheduled. The solstice celebration that had emerged organically from the community's recognition of celestial rhythm became a date on a calendar, its observance mandatory, its meanings codified, its spontaneity sacrificed to the god of planning. Mental health, insofar as we can glimpse it in the archaeological record, began showing the strain. Skeletal remains from early agricultural sites reveal not just the physical stress of repetitive labor, but markers suggesting chronic anxiety. Cortisol leaves its signature in bones, thinning them, aging them prematurely. The worried bones of early farmers tell us that paradise wasn't lost in a moment of sin, but ground away season by season under the millstone of time consciousness. The mythic mind didn't die all at once. It retreated, compressed itself into designated spaces and times. Mystery religions promised initiates a return to cyclical time, to the eternal present where gods and humans dance together. Seasonal festivals tried to recreate the old consciousness, but increasingly they became pressure valves, temporary releases from linear time rather than genuine alternatives to it. You could step outside time for a sacred week, but the calendar always waited to reclaim you. This transformation shows most clearly in how we began to think about death. For the forager, death was transformation, the body returning to earth, the spirit to the ancestor realm. The life force redistributing itself through the ecosystem like energy can neither be created nor destroyed. But agricultural time made death final in new ways. Your field wouldn't tend itself after you died. Your stored grain needed inheritors. Your debts and credits required settling. Death became deadline in the truest sense, the final accounting that couldn't be renegotiated. Writing accelerated this collapse of mythic consciousness by freezing words in time. The oral story lives and breathes, changes with each telling, adapts to present need while maintaining ancient wisdom. But the written word is fixed, dated, owned. Laws carved in stone can't bend with circumstance. Contracts written on clay tablets create obligations that outlive their context. The fluid wisdom of the storyteller hardens into the rigid law of the scribe. Even human relationships changed under the pressure of linear time. Marriage in foraging societies was often fluid, pragmatic, based on current affinity and mutual benefit. But agricultural marriage became a contract projected into the future, a merger of lands, a strategy for inheritance, a calculation about tomorrow's labor needs. Children became investments in future productivity. Love itself learned to keep accounts. By the time the great ancient civilizations emerged, Sumer and Egypt, the Indus Valley, and ancient China, the transformation was complete. Humans lived in a world of schedules, deadlines, 5-year plans projected by priest bureaucrats who read the future in star charts and sheep livers. The mythic time of eternal return was preserved in ritual and story, but increasingly disconnected from daily experience. Most people lived in linear time, worked in linear time, worried in linear time, and died watching the calendar rather than the seasons. We see the culmination of this in structures like Stonehenge or the pyramids, massive investments of labor designed to capture and control time itself. These weren't just monuments, but machines for producing eternity in a world increasingly dominated by temporality. They were attempts to build mythic time out of stones, to create spaces where the eternal present could still be accessed. But their very monumentality shows how far we'd traveled from the world where every tree was a temple and every moment could open into mystery. The calendar mind conquered because it worked, at least by the measures it created for itself. Agricultural surplus supported larger populations. Predictable time enabled long-term planning. Written records accumulated knowledge across generations in ways oral tradition couldn't match. Cities rose, technologies developed, humanity began its long march toward the modern world. Progress, that most linear of concepts, became our defining myth. But something was lost in this transition. Something we still mourn without quite knowing what we're mourning. The ability to live in deep time, to experience past and future as present reality, to know ourselves as part of cycles rather than passengers on a one-way journey. These capacities atrophied like unused muscles. We gained history, but lost myth. We gained the calendar, but lost the kind of time where healing happens, where stories live, where meaning accumulates like snow, rather than being manufactured on schedule. The mythic mind survives in fragments, in dreams where time moves sideways, in moments of deep absorption when hours vanish like minutes, in rituals that still, despite everything, transport us to that older consciousness where all times are now, all ancestors present, all possibilities simultaneously real. We touch it in poetry, in music, in love, in grief. All the places where linear time breaks down and something older breaks through. But we can't live there anymore, not fully. The calendar mind has conquered too thoroughly. We check our phones for the time dozens of times a day. We schedule our leisure. We manage our sleep cycles. We optimize our productivity. We live in a world where time is money, and money is survival, where being late is moral failing, and being early is competitive advantage. The prison of linear time is so complete, we can barely imagine what freedom would look like. Yet on certain nights, when the moon rises like it has for billions of years, when the seasons turn with the same ancient rhythm that moved our ancestors, to create stories about why something in us remembers. We remember that we are older than clocks, deeper than calendars, wider than the narrow arrow of progress. We remember that once upon a time, in that mythic once, that is also always, humans knew how to live in circles rather than lines, in spirals rather than schedules, in the eternal present tense of the sacred. The calendar was humanity's first great betrayal of cyclical time, and perhaps its most necessary. We couldn't have built civilization without it, but we also couldn't have lost our minds in quite the way we have. We are scheduled beings now, creatures of the calendar, but inside us, the mythic time still turns, waiting for moments when we remember how to step outside the prison of minutes and enter again the freedom of the eternal return. Time collapsed from circle to line, from myth to history, from the breathing rhythm of the world to the ticking mechanism of the clock. We call this progress, and perhaps it island. But progress toward what? And at what cost? These are questions only linear time can ask, but only mythic time can answer. Somewhere inside your skull, between the flicker of a notification and the whisper of an ancient craving, lives a brain that thinks the world is still made of fur and firelight. It doesn't know what TikTok Island. It has no concept of quarterly earnings reports, or mortgage refinancing, or the 47 tabs you have open right now. Your brain, for all its miraculous plasticity and apparent adaptation to modernity, is 99% Paleolithic. And that remaining 1%, the thin veneer of agricultural and industrial consciousness, is not nearly enough to override 300,000 years of programming. This is not metaphor. This is measurable neuroscience. Your amygdala processes threats with the same urgency it used to detect leopards in tall grass. Your dopamine system, calibrated by millennia of scarcity, shorts out in the face of infinite scroll. Your oxytocin receptors, designed to bond you to a small band of familiar faces, struggle to make sense of a world where you pass more strangers in a day than your ancestors met in a lifetime. You are running Ice Age software on Space Age hardware, and the bugs in the code are what we call modern life. Let's start with the raw biology. Your nervous system was sculpted across hundreds of thousands of years to thrive in a specific context. Small groups, familiar faces, cyclical time, embodied knowledge, immediate feedback, and a direct relationship between effort and reward. It expects a world where threats have teeth and claws, where food comes in seasons, where darkness means sleep and light means wake, where the people you see daily are the people you'll see tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, until one of you dies. Instead, it gets cubicles and commutes, headlines and hashtags, strangers and statistics, artificial light and artificial deadlines. A world where threats are abstract but constant, where food is abundant but empty, where you can be desperately lonely in a crowd of millions. The mismatch isn't just uncomfortable, it's pathological. And it explains why, despite living in the safest, most abundant period in human history, we are anxious, depressed, and disconnected at rates that would have been incomprehensible to our ancestors. Modern neuroscience confirms what our bodies have been screaming all along. We are built for a world that no longer exists. Take attention. that most precious and polluted of modern resources. The Paleolithic brain developed exquisite attention capabilities, but they were designed for a specific bandwidth of stimulation. Track the rustle in the grass. It might be dinner or danger. Read the micro-expressions on your hunting partner's face. Coordination depends on it. Notice the subtle changes in plant growth that signal seasonal shifts. This was attention as survival tool, refined by evolution into an instrument of stunning precision. Today, that same attention system is asked to process exponentially more information than it was designed to handle. The average American sees more advertisements in a day than a Paleolithic human saw people in a year. We are bombarded with notifications, alerts, updates, breaking news, each one triggering the same neural pathways that once fired for genuine threats. Our poor amygdalae can't tell the difference between a saber-toothed cat and a strongly worded email. Both spike cortisol. Both narrow attention. Both prepare the body for fight or flight. But unlike our ancestors, who could run or fight and then reset, we marinate in stress hormones from dawn to dusk. The prefrontal cortex, our rational pilot, tries valiantly to manage this chaos. It's the part of the brain that can understand abstract concepts like deadline and mortgage and performance review. But it's a relatively recent addition to our neural architecture, and it's constantly overruled by older, deeper systems. When your phone buzzes, it's not your prefrontal cortex that reacts first. It's your limbic system, flooding you with neurochemicals that whisper urgent, 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 even when nothing could be less urgent than another notification about someone you barely know doing something you don't care about. And then there's the dopamine disaster. This neurotransmitter, often mischaracterized as the pleasure chemical, is actually about anticipation and reward seeking. In the Paleolithic world, dopamine motivated the search for scattered resources. The uncertainty of foraging, will I find berries today, created a healthy dopamine rhythm. Effort led to reward, but not always, keeping the system sensitive and calibrated. Enter the modern world of engineered superstimuli. Social media companies employ teams of neuroscientists to make their products as addictive as possible. They've created intermittent variable reward schedules, the most powerful mechanism for dopamine manipulation. Every scroll might reveal something interesting. Every notification might be important. This hijacks the same system that once kept our ancestors searching for roots and honey, but now it searches for likes and updates, never satisfied, always craving the next hit. The result? Dopamine exhaustion. We've blown out our reward systems with constant stimulation, leaving us numb to ordinary pleasures. A sunset doesn't compete with Instagram. A conversation doesn't hit like a viral post. We need more and more stimulation to feel anything at all, chasing a neurochemical high that gets harder to achieve with each scroll. Our ancestors' dopamine systems were finely tuned instruments. Ours are broken slot machines, lever pulling our way to emptiness. Sleep tells another piece of the mismatch story. Paleolithic humans lived by light and darkness, their circadian rhythms perfectly synchronized with the Sunday. They slept in phases, often communally, with periods of quiet wakefulness in the deep night that were considered normal, even sacred time for sex, for tending fires, for the kind of conversations that only happen in darkness. Their melatonin rose with sunset, their cortisol with dawn, their bodies moving through cycles of rest and activity as naturally as breathing. We blast our retinas with blue light until midnight, shocking our pineal glands into confusion. We sleep alone in temperature-controlled boxes, divorced from the seasonal rhythms that once told our bodies when to store fat, when to be fertile, when to slow down. We panic at 3 a.m. wakefulness, medicating what was once a normal part of human sleep patterns. Then we wake to alarms rather than light, jolting our systems into activity before they're ready, starting each day in a state of minor trauma that would have signaled serious danger to our ancestors. Even the way we move, or don't, creates neurological chaos. The human body evolved for constant, varied motion. Walking, squatting, climbing, carrying, dancing. Our ancestors covered miles daily, not for exercise but for life. Their bodies were always engaged. Their proprioceptive systems constantly calibrated by interaction with uneven terrain, shifting loads, the full range of human movement. Now we sit. We sit more than any humans in history, our bodies folded into chairs like broken origami. Then we drive to gyms where we perform repetitive movements that mimic work our ancestors did naturally. We've turned movement into a scheduled activity rather than a way of being, and our bodies revolt. Lower back pain, the signature ailment of modernity, barely existed in the archaeological record. Our spines know how to move. They've forgotten how to be still. But perhaps nowhere is the mismatch more painful than in our social architecture. Humans evolved in bands of 2-5-5-0 people, max. These weren't just roommates but kin, bonded through daily interaction, mutual dependence, and shared history. You knew everyone's moods, everyone's skills, everyone's stories. Conflict was immediate and resolution necessary. You couldn't block someone you'd see at the fire that night. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar identified the cognitive limit for human social relationships at around 150, the famous Dunbar's number. This isn't just people you recognize, but people you know, their character, their relationships, their history. Our ancestors' worlds were well within this limit. Every face was familiar, every relationship multidimensional. Now we live among millions of strangers. We have friends we've never met, followers who don't know our real names. We can be desperately lonely with 1,000 contacts in our phones. Our neural systems for facial recognition, emotional attunement, and social bonding are overwhelmed by the sheer volume of partial relationships. We're dying of social thirst while drowning in social media. The stress is literally killing us. Chronic cortisol elevation, the hallmark of modern anxiety, wreaks havoc on every system in the body. It suppresses immune function, disrupts digestion, interferes with sleep, impairs memory formation, and accelerates aging. Our ancestors experienced acute stress, the tiger in the grass. But then it resolved. We experience chronic stress, the mortgage, the deadline, the endless inbox that never resolves. Our bodies, unable to fight or flee from abstract threats, turn the stress response inward. We attack ourselves because there's nowhere else for the energy to go. Even our relationship with meaning has been disrupted. The Paleolithic brain expects to see direct connections between action and result. Plant seeds, grow food, track animal, find meat, share resources, strengthen bonds. The feedback loops were immediate and visceral. Meaning wasn't something you searched for. It was embedded in every necessary action. Now we perform abstract labor for abstract rewards. We send emails that trigger other emails. We optimize metrics that correlate vaguely with profits that belong to someone else. We work jobs whose ultimate purpose we can barely articulate, receiving paychecks that represent survival but feel nothing like the satisfaction of a successful hunt or a well-made tool. Meaning has become another thing we have to manufacture, schedule, seek out in our spare time. Is it any wonder we're lost? Our brains are looking for the tribe and finding the crowd, looking for the hunt and finding the commute, looking for the fire and finding the screen, looking for the divine in everything and finding it segregated into buildings we visit once a week, if at all. We are neurologically homesick for a world that still exists in our wiring but not in our streets. The solutions offered by modern life are often more of the same poison. Stressed? Here's an app for that. More screen time to manage your screen time. Lonely? Try online dating, commodify human connection, and wonder why it feels empty. Anxious? Take a pill that numbs the messenger without addressing the message. We treat the symptoms of mismatch without acknowledging the mismatch itself. But your body remembers. It remembers in the peace that washes over you when you finally get out into nature. It remembers in the way a campfire hypnotizes you into calm. It remembers in the oxytocin surge of a long hug, the satisfaction of working with your hands, the way your breathing slows when you pet a dog. These aren't quirks or nostalgia. They're your Paleolithic brain recognizing home. We cannot go back. The world that shaped our neurology is gone, and the 8 billion humans currently alive couldn't survive as foragers even if we wanted to. But we can recognize the mismatch. We can understand that our anxiety isn't personal failure but ecological displacement. We can see our depression not as broken brain chemistry, but as appropriate response to an inappropriate environment. We can stop pathologizing our Paleolithic hearts for failing to thrive in digital cages. And we can make choices. Not perfect choices. We still have to live in this world, but choices that honor our neural inheritance. More face-to-face, less face-to-screen. More walking, less sitting. More making, less consuming. More tribe, less network. More ritual, less routine. More presence, less productivity. Small movements toward what our brains recognize as real. We are ancient beings in a modern world, running on software older than agriculture, trying to make sense of a reality that changes faster than evolution can follow. The mismatch isn't our fault, but recognizing it is our responsibility. Because until we understand what we're built for, we can't understand why we're broken. And until we understand why we're broken, we can't begin to heal. Your brain is not diseased, it's displaced. You're not failing at modern life. Modern life is failing you. And that distinction, that recognition that the problem isn't in your neurons but in the novel world they're asked to navigate, might be the beginning of finding your way back to something your ancestors knew but never had to. Name, how to be human. In a world lit by LEDs and governed by the microsecond trades of algorithms, something ancient still stirs in us when the power goes out and we light a single flame. The room changes. Not just the quality of light, though that shifts from harsh to soft, from steady to alive, but the quality of presence. The shadows breathe, conversations deepen, time slows to something your body recognizes, even if your mind has forgotten its name. For reasons we can't quite articulate, we feel safer, closer, more real. This isn't nostalgia, this is memory. Not your personal memory, but the kind carved into your nervous system by the patient repetition of 10,000 generations. The kind that lives not in your thoughts, but in the way your pupils dilate in firelight, the way your breathing slows when you hear water over stones, the way your whole being relaxes when you finally step out of the built world and into the breathing one. We are the inheritors of an impossible story. Against all odds, through ice ages and predators, through scarcity and abundance, through migrations that spanned continents and millennia, an unbroken chain of survivors links you to the first humans who looked up at stars and wondered. Every single one of your ancestors lived long enough to reproduce. Think about that. In a world of infant mortality and saber-toothed cats, of famines and floods, every single person in your lineage made it to parenthood. You are the culmination of the longest winning streak in history. And what did they leave you? Not just DNA, though that too carries messages we're only beginning to decode. They left you capacities, the ability to read weather in cloud formations, the talent for tracking that lets you find your car in a parking lot, the spatial memory that helps you navigate without GPS when the signal fails, the social intuition that warns you about someone's intentions before your rational mind catches up, the way your body knows which plants smell safe and which smell like danger, all of it dormant, maybe, dulled by disuse, but not dead, never dead. Camping feels holy because it's island, not because it's an escape from real life, but because it's a return to it. When you set up a tent beneath trees and build a fire and sit in a circle with people you care about, you're not doing something new. You're doing something so old, your bones know the motions without instruction. The satisfaction of gathering wood, the hypnotic focus of tending flames, the way stories emerge naturally as darkness falls. These aren't leisure activities. They're the practices that made us human. Watch yourself the next time you're around a campfire. Watch how your body knows exactly how far to sit, close enough for warmth, far enough to avoid smoke. Watch how your eyes track the flames in patterns that never repeat but always satisfy. Watch how silence becomes comfortable, how smartphones get forgotten, how the urgent emails that seemed so important 6 hours ago fade into irrelevance. That's not you being irresponsible. That's you remembering your actual responsibilities, to presence, to connection, to the older rhythms that industrialization tried to erase but only managed to bury. We feel it in other moments too, the peace that floods through you when you walk barefoot on grass. That's your body re-establishing electrical connection with the earth, yes, but it's also older than electricity. It's the memory of when all walking was barefoot, when the earth spoke to you through your soles and you knew how to listen. The satisfaction of making something with your hands, bread, a garden, a simple repair, carries the echo of when everything was handmade, when your survival depended on the conversation between palm and material, when craftsmanship wasn't a hobby, but the human condition. Even our modern ailments point toward what we've lost. We pay for meditation apps to teach us what silence used to provide for free. We buy white noise machines that mimic the sound of rain and wind, the acoustic environment our nervous systems expect. We take forest bathing classes to learn how to walk in woods, as if walking in woods required instruction rather than just permission. We schedule digital detoxes and consider them achievements rather than recognizing them as desperate attempts to touch base with baseline human experience. The ache goes deeper than lifestyle. When you feel that modern malaise, that sense that something essential is missing but you can't name what you're feeling, the absence of experiences your body expects but rarely receives, extended eye contact with people you trust, darkness that's actually dark, silence that's actually silent, food that grew in soil you can name, movement that serves a purpose beyond burning calories, stories told rather than consumed, rituals that mark transitions rather than holidays that mark shopping seasons. Your children know. Watch a child who's been allowed to play freely in nature. They don't need instruction manuals. They build shelters from branches and leaves, not because anyone taught them, but because shelter building is encoded in human DNA. They make up stories about animals, create rituals around found objects, form small tribes with elaborate hierarchies and rules. They're not playing at being primitive. They're practicing being human in the ways humans have always practiced, at least until we started scheduling their play and structuring their time and replacing dirt with screens. But here's what matters. It's not too late. The memory lives in you, patient as seeds in the desert, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. You don't need to abandon civilization and live in a cave. You need to remember that civilization is the new experiment, not the eternal default. You need to honor the parts of you that know things your conscious mind has forgotten. Start small, light a candle, and watch it for 10 minutes without doing anything else. Your Paleolithic brain will recognize this as prayer, meditation, and entertainment all at once. Eat a meal without screens, actually tasting what you're consuming. Your body remembers when eating was ritual, when gratitude was implicit in the act of shared food. Walk somewhere you don't need to go, just to move through space at human speed. Take the long way. Notice things. Your ancestors walked everywhere, and the walking was never just about destination. Find your people, not your network, not your contacts, Not your social media connections, but your actual people. The ones you can sit with in silence. The ones who will notice if you don't show up. The ones who know your stories and still choose to stay. Create rituals together. Not grand ceremonies, but small repeated actions that mark you as bound. Weekly dinners, monthly fires, seasonal gatherings. Your nervous system knows the difference between a crowd and a tribe, and it's dying for the latter. Touch the earth. Garden if you can, even if it's just herbs in a windowsill. Get dirt under your fingernails. Learn one wild edible plant in your area and greet it like an old friend when you pass. Swim in water that hasn't been chlorinated. Sleep outside when possible. Your body has an ongoing relationship with the living world that doesn't stop just because you live in a city. It just gets very quiet, waiting for you to resume the conversation. Practice doing nothing. Not meditation, not mindfulness, just nothing. Sit outside and watch clouds. Lie on grass and feel the earth hold you. Stand in rain and get wet. Your productivity-obsessed culture will tell you this is waste, but your body knows better. It knows that doing nothing is how you digest experience, how you reset your nervous system, how you remember what matters. The Paleolithic mind didn't differentiate between being and doing. The separation is modern, and it's killing us. And tell stories. Not content, not posts, not updates. Stories. The kind that meander and circle back and take their time getting nowhere in particular. The kind that explain why you are the way you are, that connect you to your ancestors and your descendants, that make meaning from the random events of existence. Tell them out loud to actual humans who can see your face and hear your voice. Let them interrupt. Let them add their own threads. Let the stories become communal property, the way all the best stories always have been. None of this is about romanticizing the past. The Paleolithic world contained suffering we can barely imagine. Infant mortality, death in childbirth, infections that killed in days, predators that hunted humans, weather that could erase whole bands. We don't want to go back. We can't go back. The world that shaped us is gone, and the world we've shaped can't sustain foraging bands anymore. But we can remember that we are older than agriculture, deeper than industry, wider than the narrow band of experience modern life offers. We can honor the parts of us that know how to read faces and weather, how to move with seasons and sleep with cycles, how to find the sacred in the mundane and the sufficient in the simple. We can stop pathologizing our inability to thrive in an environment we were never designed for and start creating pockets of the environment we were designed for. The memory that lives in you isn't asking for perfection. It's asking for recognition, for moments when you step out of linear time and into cyclical presence, for connections that go deeper than username, for fires that aren't metaphorical, for stories that matter, for a life that feels like life rather than an elaborate performance of productivity. Your ancestors are watching through your eyes, hoping you'll remember what they knew, that you are not separate from nature but woven into it. That meaning comes from connection, not achievement, that the point was never to have more, but to be more. They're hoping you'll light the fire again, literally, metaphorically, however you can. They're hoping you'll gather your people and tell the stories and walk the earth like you belong here. Because you do belong here, not in the artificial world of deadlines and notifications and scheduled spontaneity, but in the real world that still exists beneath the pavement, beyond the walls, between the heartbeats. The world of seasons and stars, flesh and feeling, the eternal present tense of being alive. The memory lives in you. It always has. It always will. All it's asking is that you remember to remember. So dim the lights, slow your breath, let the old knowing rise like smoke from ancient fires. Time to remember.